Hello, friend. Settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into England in 1887, and into the home of a woman who was neither rich nor poor, neither nobility nor servant, but a solicitor's wife raising 4 children in a house most people around her considered entirely ordinary, except her ordinary looked rather different from ours. She lived only a few years after married women gained the right to keep property and earnings in their own names. Each morning she dressed in layers that shaped the way she stood, moved and breathed, and inside the family medicine cupboard were remedies sold by respectable chemists containing ingredients that would never be permitted in children's medicine today. We're going to encounter many details like these tonight, slowly, one at a time, folded into the story of one particular woman's very ordinary, quietly extraordinary day. Just a small moment before we begin. If these gentle evenings have become a comfort to you, subscribing would mean more than you know. And if tonight helps ease your mind towards sleep, a like really does keep this little channel going. Tell me in the comments where you're curled up tonight. Maybe with the air conditioning humming low somewhere in Chicago, or by an open window with a fan turning slowly somewhere in the English countryside. I always read every single one. All right, love, let's begin. The house sits on a quiet street where the lamps are lit by hand each evening, and at 6:30 in the morning, before the lamplighter has even finished his rounds on the far end of the road, a woman named Eleanor Whitmore is already awake. She does not leap out of bed. She lies still for a moment, listening to the particular silence of a house that has not yet started its day. The creak of a floorboard somewhere below, as someone moves through the kitchen, the faint clink of a coal scuttle being filled. Eleanor is 42 years old, and she has lived in this house for 16 years, long enough that she knows every sound it makes without having to think about what it means. Her husband, Charles, sleeps a little longer than she does, on most mornings. He's a solicitor with a modest but respectable practice in town, the kind of work that pays the rent on a comfortable house and keeps 4 children fed and dressed without ever quite making them rich. Eleanor has learned, over the years, to move quietly around him in these early hours, though this morning he stirs anyway, murmuring something about the time before turning over again. She rises first. The room is cold, the fire having gone out sometime after midnight, and she reaches for her dressing gown, a heavy wool thing gone soft with age, before crossing to the window. She draws back the curtain just enough to see the street below, still grey with early light, a milk cart rattling past 2 houses down. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to this hour. Not the quiet of night, which feels closed and private, but the quiet of a day not yet begun, when everything is still possible and nothing has gone wrong yet. Eleanor has always liked this hour best, though she's never said so to anyone, not even Charles. She washes at the basin in the corner of the room, the water still cool from the night, and there is something almost bracing about it, a small shock that clears the last of the sleep from her mind. She does not linger. There is too much waiting downstairs, too many small decisions that only she seems able to make. Her hair takes the longest. She sits at the small dressing table, its surface crowded with hairpins and a silver-backed brush that had belonged to her mother, and begins the long, familiar process of pinning it into place. It is not vanity exactly, though there is some of that in it too. A woman of her situation is expected to look a certain way, hair neat and controlled, nothing loose or careless, and Eleanor has done this so many thousands of times that her hands know the motions better than her mind does. She dresses in a plain morning gown of dark blue wool, practical rather than fashionable, the kind of dress meant for the early hours before visitors might call. The bodice fastens with a long row of small buttons up the front, and she does these herself quickly without a mirror, her fingers finding each one by feel. Downstairs the house is beginning to wake in earnest. There is a girl, Sarah, who comes in most mornings to help with the heavier work, laying fires and carrying water, though the family cannot afford and would not particularly want a large staff of servants. Eleanor hears her in the kitchen now, the scrape of the grate being cleared, and there is comfort in that sound too, the knowledge that some things happen whether or not she is there to watch them. But it is Eleanor herself who plans the day's meals, who checks the household accounts each week with a small, careful hand in a leather-bound ledger, who decides which tradesman gets paid first when money is tight, which it sometimes is, more often than her husband likely realises. She pauses at the top of the stairs before going down, one hand resting on the banister, and there is a strange stillness in this small pause. In a moment, she will be mother. She will be the mistress of this house. She will be 100 small things to 100 small demands. But right now, for one breath, she is only herself. Then she goes down. The children are beginning to stir above her. She can hear it even from the hallway. The particular thump of feet hitting the floor that belongs to her son Thomas, who is 11 and has never once in his life woken quietly. Above that, fainter, the softer movements of her eldest daughter, Margaret, who is 19 now and has begun this past year to take a very long time getting ready in the mornings. Eleanor smiles faintly at the thought of it. She remembers being 19 herself, though it feels now like remembering someone else's life entirely. The dining room is cool when she enters it, the fire not yet properly caught, and she crouches for a moment to coax it along with the small brass poker kept by the hearth. There is something satisfying in this small task, watching the flame catch and steady, the room slowly beginning to warm around her. The table is laid simply, a cloth of white linen, worn soft from years of washing, plates arranged with the quiet precision Eleanor insists on without ever quite explaining why. It matters to her that things be in order, perhaps because so much of life refuses to be. Charles comes down not long after, dressed for his office in a dark coat that has been carefully brushed the night before, his collar stiff and white against his throat. He kisses Eleanor's cheek in passing, a small habitual gesture, and settles into his chair with the newspaper already half open in his hand. They do not speak much at breakfast, not out of coldness, but out of the particular ease of 16 years of marriage, where silence has stopped meaning anything is wrong. He reads. She pours the tea. Somewhere above them, a door closes and footsteps start down the stairs. Margaret enters first among the children, and there is a small, private pleasure Eleanor takes in watching her daughter walk into a room these days. Margaret has her father's dark hair and her mother's way of holding her chin just slightly too high, and she dresses now with real care, aware in a way she was not 2 years ago that how she appears matters, that she is being watched and considered by the world in a manner she never was as a girl. This is one of the strange griefs of motherhood that no one prepares you for, Eleanor has found. Not losing a child, but watching one become, slowly and irreversibly, a person separate from you, with opinions about a hair ribbon that have nothing to do with what her mother thinks. Margaret takes her seat and reaches for the toast rack without quite looking at anyone, still half caught in whatever she had been thinking about upstairs. Eleanor watches her a moment longer than necessary before turning her attention to the teapot. I want to pause here for a second, because I think there is something worth noticing in this particular kind of morning. Nothing dramatic is happening, no one has said anything remarkable, and yet there is a whole world contained in it, a family finding its shape again after a night apart, each person carrying something private into a room they will share for the next half hour. Thomas arrives next loudly, as he does most things, sliding into his chair with his hair still damp from washing and one sock slightly askew, in a way his mother will notice and correct before he leaves the house. He is at that age where he seems to be entirely elbows and appetite, and he reaches for the bread before his father has even finished saying grace, earning a look from Eleanor that he pretends not to see. The youngest, Alice, comes down last, still half asleep, her nightgown only just changed for a day dress that her mother helped her into moments before. She's 7, small enough still to be lifted onto her chair, and she does exactly that this morning, arms raised toward her mother without a word, as though the request were too obvious to need speaking. Eleanor lifts her without hesitation, though her back protests slightly, a small ache she has come to expect and mostly ignore. There is something in the weight of a small child, even a light one, that feels different from every other kind of weight in the world. Breakfast itself is simple: bread and butter, a pot of marmalade, Eleanor made herself in late summer, boiled eggs for the children, tea for the adults, and a small cup of milky tea. More milk than tea, really, for Alice, who insists she is old enough for the real thing. The conversation, when it comes, is small and ordinary. Charles mentions a case at his office, something about a disputed property boundary that has apparently dragged on for the better part of a year. Thomas asks whether he might be excused from his Latin lesson that morning, a request denied before he has even finished making it. Margaret says almost nothing, though Eleanor notices her glancing twice toward the window, as though watching for something, or someone. It will turn out later that a certain young man has been walking past the house rather more often than coincidence would suggest, though Eleanor will not learn this until the following week, from a neighbour rather than from her own daughter, which stings a little more than she would ever admit aloud. After breakfast, the household begins to separate into its various currents. Charles finishes his tea, folds the newspaper with the same precise motion he uses every morning, and goes to fetch his coat and hat from the hall stand. Eleanor walks with him to the door, as she does most mornings, not because it is expected exactly, but because some part of her still likes the small ritual of it, watching him step out into the street and become, for the hours until evening, a person she does not see. He kisses her cheek again at the door. Do not let Thomas talk his way out of his lessons, he says, which is as close as Charles ever comes to a joke before 9 in the morning. Eleanor promises nothing and closes the door behind him with a soft click. Now the house belongs, in a sense, entirely to her. Thomas is sent upstairs to the small room set aside as a schoolroom, where a tutor arrives 3 mornings a week to drill him in Latin and arithmetic, subjects he resists with the particular energy of a boy who would rather be anywhere else. On the mornings without a tutor, Eleanor hears him through the floor above, reciting something in a flat, unwilling monotone that makes her smile despite herself. Margaret lingers at the table a moment longer, and Eleanor takes the opportunity, as she often does, to sit back down across from her daughter, with her own cup of tea now gone lukewarm. There is a particular kind of conversation that happens only in these stolen minutes, mother and daughter alone at a table not yet cleared, and Eleanor has come to treasure it more than she once expected to. Margaret talks, when she talks at all, in a roundabout way, circling whatever is actually on her mind for several minutes before arriving at it. This morning it is a dress, a blue one, ordered weeks ago, that has still not arrived from the dressmaker. I do not think Mrs. Carrow even remembers she has it, Margaret says, with the particular exasperation of a 19-year-old convinced the world moves too slowly around her own concerns. Eleanor promises to send a note that afternoon, and privately suspects the dress has very little to do with what is actually troubling her daughter this week. There is a young man. There is nearly always a young man at this age, though Margaret has said almost nothing directly. Eleanor knows the shape of it, mostly from small things. A particular flush when a certain name comes up at a dinner, a new interest in walking to church rather than taking the carriage, though it is barely half a mile and no one has ever needed convincing before to walk it. Eleanor does not ask directly. She remembers, with a clarity that still surprises her sometimes, exactly what it felt like to be watched too closely at 19, to have every small feeling noticed and commented on, by parents who meant well and made everything worse by meaning it. She would rather wait for Margaret to bring it to her, in her own time, in her own roundabout way. Alice, meanwhile, has wandered off toward the small parlour at the back of the house, where a box of wooden toys and a rag doll with a slightly worn face wait for her most mornings. Eleanor can hear her narrating some private drama to herself in the next room, the doll apparently cast as either a queen or a naughty younger sister. It is difficult to tell which from the tone alone. By 9 o'clock, Eleanor has moved into what she privately thinks of as the working part of her day, though it looks, to anyone glancing in, like nothing more than a woman sitting at a small writing desk in the morning room with a ledger open before her. The household accounts are not glamorous work, and Eleanor has never pretended otherwise. Butcher, baker, coal merchant, the dressmaker who has not yet sent Margaret's blue dress, the girl who comes in to help with the washing, all of it recorded in careful columns, added and checked and added again. Charles earns a comfortable living, but comfortable is not the same as unlimited, and there have been years, particularly the winter Thomas was so ill with the fever, when the numbers in this ledger kept Eleanor awake at night in a way she never mentioned to her husband. This week at least the columns balance well enough. She allows herself a small breath of relief before turning to the stack of correspondence that has accumulated on the corner of the desk. There is a letter from her sister in the north, full of news about nephews and nieces Eleanor has not seen in over a year, and a shorter note from a Mrs. Ashworth 2 streets over, proposing a call on Thursday afternoon. There is also, tucked beneath the others, an invitation to a small evening gathering the following week, the kind of modest social occasion that fills the calendar of a family in their position, not grand enough to require weeks of preparation, but important enough that Eleanor will need to think carefully about what to wear. She answers what needs answering in a neat, upright hand, sealing each note with a small amount of wax pressed with a plain brass seal that had been a wedding gift from Charles's mother, now some years gone. There is something satisfying in the whole small process, the scratch of the pen, the particular smell of the sealing wax as it melts, the quiet click of the desk drawer closing over it all when she is finished. Around 10, she goes through to the kitchen to speak with Sarah about the day's meals, a conversation that takes only a few minutes but requires, Eleanor has found, a certain careful attention. There will be a joint of mutton for dinner and a lighter luncheon of soup and cold meat, and Eleanor checks the pantry herself before deciding, running a practiced eye over what remains of last week's shopping. The kitchen is warm in a way the rest of the house is not yet, the range going steadily, and there is a smell of baking bread that Eleanor pauses to enjoy for a moment longer than strictly necessary. This is not glamorous work either, managing a household, but there is a kind of quiet competence in it that Eleanor has come, over 16 years, to take real pride in. A house that runs smoothly, a family that is fed and clothed and does not want for much. These things do not happen by themselves, whatever the world outside might assume. By late morning, the house has settled into its own particular rhythm, and Eleanor allows herself, for perhaps half an hour, the rare luxury of sitting with nothing urgent in front of her. She takes up a piece of needlework she has been slowly finishing for weeks, a small embroidered cushion cover meant for Margaret's eventual trousseau. Though neither of them says that word aloud yet, it feels too soon, too presumptuous, given that there is no engagement, no announced understanding, nothing but a certain flush at dinner and a new fondness for walking to church. Still, Eleanor stitches, and there is something meditative in the small, repeated motion, needle through fabric, thread pulled taut, needle through fabric again. Her mother taught her this particular stitch, decades ago now, and there are moments, sitting here with the light coming through the window just so, when Eleanor feels her mother's presence almost physically, as though the motion itself has been passed down along with the pattern. The parlour around her is comfortable rather than fashionable, furnished mostly with pieces inherited or acquired slowly over the years of her marriage, a worn but good armchair by the fire, a small table that had belonged to Charles's grandmother, its surface bearing the faint rings of 100 forgotten teacups despite Eleanor's best efforts with beeswax and polish. On the mantel, a row of photographs in oval frames, her wedding portrait among them, a young woman who looks both entirely familiar and strangely distant, as though Eleanor is looking at someone she used to know rather than herself. She pauses over the wedding photograph sometimes, when the house is quiet like this. 23 years old in that picture, standing rigid in her wedding dress beside a Charles who looks almost comically young to her now, both of them so serious, so aware of the importance of the occasion, that neither had quite managed a natural expression for the photographer. She remembers being terrified that day, not of Charles exactly, but of the sheer size of what she was agreeing to, an entire life, unknown and unmapped, folded into one afternoon. 16 years later, the unknown has become entirely known. She could describe, without thinking, the exact sound Charles makes clearing his throat before he is about to disagree with something. The particular way he folds his newspaper when he is finished with it, the small furrow that appears between his eyebrows when a case is not going well, even though he never says so directly at dinner. This is what a long marriage gives you, Eleanor thinks, setting the needlework down for a moment. Not the drama of falling in love, which she remembers now as something almost separate from her actual life, a story that happened to a younger version of herself. What it gives you instead is this, a whole language of small gestures, built up slowly over years, that no one else in the world could read. Luncheon comes at 12:30, lighter than breakfast, taken mostly by Eleanor and the children since Charles rarely comes home in the middle of the day, his office being some distance across town. Thomas eats quickly, already restless to be released from the schoolroom for the afternoon, and Alice picks at her soup with the particular slowness of a child who would rather be doing almost anything else. Margaret eats even less, and Eleanor notices, without commenting on it, that her daughter has hardly touched the cold meat at all. There is a certain kind of appetite that disappears when a person is waiting for something. Eleanor remembers that too, though she keeps the observation to herself. By early afternoon, Eleanor has an errand of her own to attend to, and she dresses for it with more care than she gave her morning gown, changing into a walking dress of dove-grey wool, trimmed modestly at the collar and cuffs, respectable without being showy, exactly the kind of thing a solicitor's wife wears to walk through town on an ordinary Tuesday. She pins a small hat into place before the mirror, checking the angle twice, and pulls on gloves that have been carefully mended at one fingertip where the seam gave way last winter. Clothing, for a woman in Eleanor's position, is never simply clothing. It is a kind of language, spoken silently to everyone who passes her on the street, announcing exactly where she belongs in the world, without a single word needing to be said. Too plain, and people might wonder whether the Whitmores were struggling. Too fine, and people would wonder something worse, that the family was living beyond its means, putting on airs it could not afford. Eleanor has learnt, over years of careful practice, exactly where the line sits, and she dresses herself each day with that line firmly in mind, whether she thinks about it consciously or not. She takes Alice with her, the child delighted at the prospect of an outing, skipping slightly on the pavement until Eleanor reminds her, gently, that young ladies do not skip in public, a rule Alice obeys for perhaps 30 seconds before forgetting it entirely. The street outside is busy in the particular way of a comfortable town in the late morning, tradesmen's carts rattling over the cobbles, a pair of women Eleanor recognizes vaguely from church nodding to her as they pass, a boy delivering something wrapped in brown paper at a neighbouring house. There is a smell of horses and coal smoke in the air, underneath it something sweeter, bread perhaps, from a bakery 2 doors down that Eleanor has never quite managed to walk past without buying something. Today she does not stop there. Her errand is to the dressmaker, Mrs. Carow, whose shop sits at the far end of the high street behind a window displaying a single elegant bonnet that changes every few weeks and that Eleanor has long suspected exists purely to draw women in rather than to actually be sold. Mrs. Carow herself is apologetic when Eleanor mentions Margaret's blue dress, blaming a shipment of fabric that arrived late from the wholesaler, and promises it within the week, a promise Eleanor accepts with polite skepticism, having heard some version of it before. Still, she takes the opportunity to look over a bolt of pale green muslin that has just come in, running the fabric between her fingers, imagining it made up for Margaret for the summer, before deciding, with real regret, that the household accounts do not currently allow for it. This is one of the smaller griefs of managing a household carefully, Eleanor has found. Not deprivation exactly, the family wants for very little that truly matters, but a constant, quiet arithmetic running beneath every pleasant thing, every bolt of pretty fabric weighed silently against the coal bill, the school fees, the sum still owed to the butcher from last month. She leaves the shop with nothing purchased, Alice's hand back in hers, and turns toward home by a slightly longer route, past the small park where a nursemaid is walking 2 younger children in a perambulator, past the church where Margaret has developed her sudden enthusiasm for walking. There is no sign, today, of whatever or whoever draws her daughter's attention on Sunday mornings, and Eleanor finds herself almost disappointed on Margaret's behalf, though she says nothing of this to Alice, who has found a stick on the pavement and is now dragging it along the iron railings with a rhythmic clatter that Eleanor allows to continue for longer than she probably should. back at home. The afternoon settles into its own quieter rhythm. Thomas has finished with his lessons and gone out to the small back garden, where he is engaged in some elaborate game involving a wooden sword and an enemy visible only to himself. Margaret has retreated to her room with a novel, the kind of sentimental story Eleanor privately considers rather silly, but has learnt not to say so aloud, remembering her own devotion to similarly silly stories at the same age. Eleanor herself returns to the parlour, and there is a call to prepare for, Mrs. Ashworth arriving at 3 as promised, and there is a particular choreography to receiving a caller that Eleanor performs almost without thinking now, the good china brought down, a small plate of biscuits arranged, the fire built up just enough to be welcoming without being warm enough to seem wasteful. Mrs. Ashworth arrives precisely on time, as she always does, a stout, cheerful woman some years older than Eleanor, whose husband owns a modest but successful ironmonger's in town. Their friendship is not a deep one, not the kind Eleanor might have chosen freely in different circumstances, but it is a comfortable one, built up over years of shared teas and shared complaints about servants and children and the price of coal. They talk for the better part of an hour, mostly about nothing in particular. A wedding 2 streets over that Mrs. Ashworth found underwhelming, a rumour about the new curate at church, whether he is engaged or not, a question that seems to occupy a startling amount of the neighbourhood's collective attention. Eleanor listens more than she speaks, as is generally her habit in company, offering small comments here and there, and there is something restful in it, in letting someone else's words fill the room for a while. It is only as Mrs. Ashworth is preparing to leave, gloves already half pulled on, that she mentions, almost in passing, having seen Margaret speaking with a young man outside the chemist's shop the previous week. A Mr. Farrow, she believes, newly arrived in town, something to do with the bank. Eleanor keeps her expression carefully neutral, thanking Mrs. Ashworth for the visit, seeing her to the door with all the usual pleasantries, but something settles in her chest as the door closes, a small, complicated feeling that she cannot entirely untangle. Not anger, not exactly. Something closer to the particular ache of realizing your child has an entire life now that does not include you, has secrets and small joys, and probably small fears too, that she is choosing not to share. She thinks of finding Margaret directly, asking outright, but decides against it, at least for today. There will be a right moment for this conversation, and a call from Mrs. Ashworth's overheard gossip does not feel like it. By 4 o'clock, the light outside has begun that particular slow amber shift that belongs to late afternoon, and Eleanor moves through the house lighting the first lamps of the evening, a task she still prefers to do herself rather than leave to Sarah, though she could not entirely explain why. There is something in the small ritual of it, the scratch of the match, the flare and settle of the flame behind glass, that she finds genuinely soothing. The children are called in for tea around this hour, a lighter meal than dinner proper, bread and butter and a seed cake Eleanor made 2 days before, kept in the tin in the pantry, and now beginning to run low. Thomas returns from the garden with grass-stained knees and a scratch on one hand from his imaginary battle, and Eleanor examines it briefly before deciding it needs nothing more than a stern look and a reminder to be more careful. Margaret comes down from her room with her novel still in hand, marking her place with one finger before setting it reluctantly aside at the table. Eleanor watches her daughter across the teapot and thinks of Mrs. Ashworth's small piece of gossip, turning it over privately without yet deciding what, if anything, to do with it. Alice, meanwhile, has smuggled her rag doll to the table despite the standing rule against toys at meals, propping it against the sugar bowl where it watches the proceedings with its slightly worn embroidered face. Eleanor notices and says nothing, choosing her battles as she has learnt to do over the years, and there is something in the small defiance that makes her want to smile rather than scold. Tea moves slowly, the way these small daily rituals do in a house like this one, and there is a particular comfort in its very ordinariness. The same china, the same seed cake, the same small complaints from Thomas about the 2 thin slices of bread that Eleanor has come to depend on more than she probably realizes. Afterward, while the children scatter again to their various afternoon occupations, Eleanor allows herself a rare quarter hour with a book of her own, something she indulges in less often than she would like. most days consumed entirely by the small, ceaseless work of running a household. Today it is a slim volume of poetry that had belonged to her mother, its spine cracked from years of handling, and she reads only a few pages before her attention drifts, not from boredom but from the sheer fatigue of a day that began before 6 and has not truly paused since. There is a particular kind of tiredness that belongs to women in Eleanor's position, she has come to understand, one that has very little to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the constant, quiet vigilance required to keep so many small things running smoothly at once. The accounts, the meals, the children's moods and needs and half-spoken worries, her husband's collar, checked each morning for fraying. It is not dramatic work. None of it makes for an interesting story told at a dinner party, and yet by 4 in the afternoon most days, Eleanor feels it settle into her shoulders like a weight she has simply learnt to carry without complaint. She sets the poetry aside eventually, and goes upstairs to check on preparations for the evening, pausing first in her own bedroom to examine her reflection in the tall mirror that stands in the corner. The dove-grey walking dress has held up well enough through the afternoon, though a stray thread has come loose at one cuff, and she makes a small mental note to mend it before wearing the dress again. Her hair, too, wants tidying after the walk into town, a few strands having escaped their pins, and she sits again at the dressing table to repair the damage, the same silver-backed brush moving through hair that has, she notices without particular distress, begun showing threads of grey at the temples these past 2 years. She is 42. It seems a strange thing to say aloud even to herself, 42 years old, a phrase that still feels, somehow, like it belongs to a different, older woman entirely. She thinks briefly of her own mother at this age, a memory softened now by the years since her mother's death, but still sharp in certain details, the particular way her mother had of humming under her breath while sewing, a habit Eleanor finds herself doing now too, unconsciously, and wonders whether Margaret will one day catch herself doing the same thing, humming some tune she cannot place, and feel her own mother's presence the way Eleanor sometimes feels hers. There is a small box on the dressing table, rosewood, its hinges slightly stiff with age, that holds what little jewellery Eleanor owns. Nothing extravagant, a string of pearls that were a wedding gift from Charles's family, a small gold brooch that had belonged to her mother, a pair of earrings she wears perhaps twice a year for the more formal occasions their calendar requires. She opens it now, not to wear anything, simply to look, running one finger over the pearls before closing the lid again. Downstairs, the preparations for dinner have begun in earnest, and Eleanor goes down to oversee the final details, though Sarah manages most of the actual cooking capably enough by now, 16 years of Eleanor's careful instruction having produced a girl who can be trusted, mostly, to manage a joint of mutton without disaster. Charles returns a little after 6, the sound of the front door and his particular tread in the hallway as familiar to Eleanor as her own heartbeat by now. She meets him in the hall, as she does most evenings, and there is a small, wordless exchange in the look they give each other, a question and an answer both. "How was your day?" and a reply, tiring but well enough, communicated entirely without speech. He looks tired tonight, more than usual, and over the sherry they share before dinner, a small nightly ritual of their own, he mentions, briefly, the difficult case from that morning, the property dispute that has apparently grown even more tangled as the day progressed. Eleanor listens, asks the right small questions, and does not mention Mrs. Ashworth's gossip about Margaret, deciding the evening does not need that particular weight added to it, not tonight, when Charles already looks so worn. Dinner itself is the most formal meal of the day, though formal in this house means only that the family dresses slightly more carefully, and Charles says a proper grace rather than the abbreviated version that suffices at breakfast. The mutton is good, the vegetables from their own small kitchen garden at the back of the house, and there is a particular pleasure Eleanor takes in watching her family eat a meal she planned, and in large part prepared, even if her own hands did not do the actual cooking tonight. Conversation at dinner is livelier than at breakfast, the whole day's small events finally having time to surface. Thomas recounts his garden battle in dramatic detail. Alice interrupts twice to add embellishments of her own that have nothing to do with what actually happened, and Charles, despite his tiredness, manages a dry joke about the imaginary enemy's tactical errors that makes even Margaret laugh. briefly the first real laugh Eleanor has heard from her daughter all day. It is a good moment, one of the small, unremarkable good moments that Eleanor has learnt over the years not to take for granted. She catches Charles's eye across the table during the laughter, and there is a whole conversation in that single glance too, a shared awareness of exactly how fortunate this ordinary evening actually is. 4 healthy children, a table with food on it, a house that is warm and dry and entirely their own. After dinner, the family disperses again in its usual patterns. Charles retreats to his small study with a pipe and the remainder of the day's newspaper. Thomas is sent up for his bath, a nightly negotiation that never seems to grow easier despite years of practice, and Eleanor can hear, even from the parlour, the particular splashing and protesting that accompanies this ritual most evenings. Margaret and Alice remain downstairs a little longer, Margaret reading again, Alice engaged in some quiet game with her doll near the fire, and Eleanor takes up her needlework once more. The same cushion cover from the morning, a few more stitches added in the lamplight before her eyes begin to tire. Thomas's bath is the noisiest event of the evening, conducted in a tin tub set before the nursery fire, water carried up in cans by Sarah and topped with a kettle from the kitchen to take the worst of the chill off. He splashes more than strictly necessary, protests the soap in his eyes with the theatrical outrage of a boy convinced he is being personally persecuted, and emerges eventually pink and damp and considerably more subdued, wrapped in a towel that has been warming by the fire. Alice's bath follows in the same tub, the water reused to save both the effort of hauling more and the cost of heating it, a small economy Eleanor has practiced without particular thought for years now, the way most households of their means do. Alice, unlike her brother, finds the whole process delightful rather than tortuous, and lingers in the cooling water until Eleanor, only slightly amused, insists she come out before she catches a chill. There is something Eleanor finds genuinely soothing in this particular hour of the evening, despite the noise and the damp and the general chaos of 2 children being readied for bed at once. She dries Alice's hair herself, a task she has never quite trusted to Sarah, working a comb gently through the tangles while Alice recounts, in increasingly sleepy fragments, some elaborate story about her doll's imaginary adventures that day. The nursery smells of soap and warm cotton, and the particular mineral smell of the coal fire, and the 2 younger children's night clothes, laid out earlier by Eleanor herself, wait folded on their small beds, flannel gowns soft from repeated washing, warm enough for a house that, however comfortable, is never quite as warm as one might wish once the fires begin banking down for the night. Thomas is asleep almost before Eleanor has finished tucking the blankets around him, worn out by his afternoon battles and the exertions of his bath, and she stands over him a moment longer than necessary, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the particular stillness of a sleeping child that never fails to catch at something in her, no matter how many hundreds of times she has witnessed it. Alice takes longer to settle, insisting on a story, and Eleanor obliges with a shortened, half-improvised version of one she has told perhaps 100 times before, the details shifting slightly each retelling, depending on how tired she is herself. Tonight the story is briefer than usual, and Alice is asleep before the ending, her small hand still curled around the rag doll's worn embroidered arm. Eleanor sits a moment in the near dark of the nursery after both children have settled, the fire burned down now to a low orange glow, and there is a particular kind of peace in this stillness that she has come to treasure more with each passing year, knowing, in some part of her mind she rarely lets herself examine too closely, that these evenings of small children and bedtime stories will not last forever. Already Margaret is 19, and thinking of young men with positions at the bank. Thomas will be off to school proper before too many more years pass. Alice, too, will grow, will stop wanting stories told by her mother's voice in the dark. She leaves the nursery door cracked slightly, the way both children prefer, and goes to check on Margaret, who has retreated to her own room with her novel and a single candle, the larger lamp reserved for the more communal rooms of the house. Margaret's room, at 19, has begun to look less like a child's room and more like a young woman's. Small changes accumulated over the past year that Eleanor has watched with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet grief, a collection of pressed flowers in a book on the shelf, a small mirror, new this spring, angled just so beside the window where the light is best for arranging hair. The novel itself, its cover worn soft, is exactly the sort of sentimental romance Eleanor remembers loving helplessly at the same age, before life taught her that real marriages look rather different from the ones described in such books. Quieter, less dramatic, built more on shared silence than on grand declarations. "Mother," Margaret says, without looking up from her page, "do you think Mrs. Ashworth talks about everyone the way she talks about the new curate?" Eleanor considers the question carefully before answering, recognizing it for what it likely is, an indirect approach towards something else entirely. "Probably," she says finally, "I think Mrs. Ashworth simply likes to talk about anyone at all, and it is rarely worth taking too seriously." Margaret nods slowly, apparently satisfied, or at least willing to let the subject drop, and returns to her novel. Eleanor lingers a moment longer in the doorway, debating whether to press further, to finally ask directly about the young man from the bank, about Sunday walks to church that take considerably longer than half a mile should require. But something in her daughter's posture, a kind of careful, deliberate casualness, tells her the moment has not quite arrived yet, and she decides again to wait. "Good night, my dear," she says instead, and Margaret murmurs something similar without quite looking up, already half returned to whatever fictional drama has captured her attention. Eleanor makes her way back downstairs, where Charles remains in his study, and Alice's small distant snoring can be heard faintly even through the closed nursery door if one stands still enough to listen. The house at this hour has a different quality entirely from the busy morning, a settling quiet, the day's demands mostly discharged, only the last small tasks remaining before Eleanor, too, might finally rest. She checks the fires one final time, banking the parlour grate down to something that will hold through the night without wasting coal, and extinguishes the lamps one by one as she moves through the downstairs rooms, until only the small light from Charles's study and a single candle she carries herself remain to guide her back up the stairs. Her own bath waits for her upstairs, the water carried up earlier and kept from cooling too badly by a folded blanket laid over the tub, a small trick she learnt from her own mother years ago. The bathroom itself is modest by the standards of grander houses, no fixed plumbing beyond a basin and a jug, the actual bathing still done in a portable tub set before the bedroom fire, much as it was for the children, though Eleanor's privacy is respected here in a way the children's is not. The door firmly closed, Sarah long since dismissed for the evening. There is something Eleanor has always found quietly luxurious about this particular hour, whatever its practical inconveniences. The water, still faintly warm, the fire casting soft moving light across the walls, the whole house finally still around her. She unpins her hair first, letting it fall loose down her back, grey threads catching the firelight in a way that does not displease her nearly as much as she once feared it might. The corset comes off with the particular relief that Eleanor suspects every woman of her generation understands without needing it explained. A long exhale as the ribs are finally allowed their full range again, the boning set aside on the chair where it will wait, patient and unyielding, for tomorrow morning's reconstruction of the day's respectable silhouette. She has worn one every day since she was perhaps 15 years old, and there are moments, rare and private, when Eleanor allows herself to simply notice how it feels to be without it, the strange lightness, almost like floating. She washes slowly, unhurried now that the children are settled, and Charles occupied with his own evening reading, working a bar of plain soap over skin that has, she notices without much distress, softened and settled into the shape of a woman who has borne 4 children and run a household for 16 years. It is not the same body that stood so rigid in that wedding photograph downstairs, and there was a time, in her late 20s perhaps, when that comparison might have troubled her more. It troubles her very little now. This body has done a great deal of quiet, necessary work, and Eleanor has come to regard it with something closer to gratitude than vanity. The water has cooled considerably by the time she finishes, and she dries herself quickly before the fire, pulling on a nightgown of soft, worn cotton, warmer than it looks, before sitting once more at the dressing table to brush out her hair for the night. 100 strokes, a habit instilled by her own mother so long ago that Eleanor no longer even counts them consciously. her hand simply knowing when the work is done. It is in this quiet hour, hair loose, face bare of the small daily performance of respectability, that Eleanor allows herself to think most freely, and tonight her thoughts return, as they often do, to the photographs arranged along the mantel downstairs and the smaller collection kept here in her own room. Tucked into a drawer of the dressing table itself, there is one of her own mother, taken not long before her death, a formal portrait that shows a woman Eleanor recognizes and does not recognize both at once, older than Eleanor remembers her feeling, though she must have been younger, in that photograph, than Eleanor is herself right now. This particular fact catches at her sometimes, unexpectedly, the strange arithmetic of it, that she has now outlived her own mother's face as she remembers it best. There is also a small daguerreotype, older still, softened at the edges, that shows Eleanor herself as a child of perhaps 5, solemn-faced in a stiff white dress, standing beside a father she barely remembers except through this single preserved image and a handful of second-hand stories told to her over the years by relatives now themselves growing old. She keeps it not for any clear memory it stirs, since she has none, but for the simple fact of its existence, proof that a whole prior life led, eventually, to this one, to this room, this house, these sleeping children down the hall. A soft knock comes at the door, and Charles enters without waiting for a reply, as he generally does at this hour, already in his own night clothes, the pipe smoke from his study still faintly clinging to him. He crosses to the bed and sits on his own side of it, working at his cufflinks though he no longer wears the shirt that requires them, an old habit that has simply never quite left him. Long day, he says, not really a question, and Eleanor makes a small sound of agreement, setting down the hairbrush at last. They do not speak a great deal in these final minutes before sleep, and there is no need to. Charles asks briefly whether the accounts balanced this week, and Eleanor confirms they did, deciding again not to mention Mrs. Ashworth's gossip about Margaret and the young man from the bank, some conversations belonging more properly to daylight than to this soft, tired hour before rest. She climbs into bed beside him, the sheets cold at first before her body's warmth begins to settle into them, and there is a particular comfort in the familiar weight and shape of a husband beside her after 16 years. Not passion exactly, not any longer, though she remembers that too, somewhere further back. What remains now is something steadier, a known presence, a body that has simply always, for the whole of her adult life, been there beside her at the end of every single day. Charles extinguishes the candle, and the room falls into the particular darkness of a house with its fires banked low, only the faintest orange glow still visible from the grate, slowly fading toward black. Eleanor lies still for a while, listening to Charles's breathing beside her gradually slow and deepen, and her mind moves, unhurried now, back over the small events of the day. Margaret at breakfast, glancing toward the window, Mrs. Ashworth's careful gossip about the chemist's shop, Thomas's imaginary battle in the garden, Alice's doll propped against the sugar bowl, none of it dramatic, all of it, somehow, precious in a way Eleanor rarely lets herself fully examine while the day is still happening, too busy managing it to properly notice it. There is relief in this too, she thinks, in the quiet dark, a relief that comes every single night at roughly this same hour, the relief of the whole family gathered safely under one roof, fed, washed, settled, nothing more required of her until the lamplighter makes his rounds again tomorrow morning, and the entire gentle machinery of the household starts once more. Tomorrow there will be Margaret's blue dress to check on again, and perhaps, finally, a conversation about the young man from the bank. There will be Thomas's Latin, resisted as always. There will be the accounts to review, the coal to manage, 100 small decisions only Eleanor seems positioned to make, but that is tomorrow's work, still some hours off yet. For now, in this exact moment, there is only the dark and the low banked warmth of the fire, and Charles breathing steadily beside her, and somewhere down the hall, 2 smaller sets of lungs doing the same. Eleanor closes her eyes and lets the day, finally, entirely go. Let me take you back a little to something I skimmed over too quickly in the morning telling of this day. Eleanor's dressing, the actual mechanics of it, deserves more attention than I gave it, because there is a whole small architecture to how a woman like Eleanor prepares herself each morning that most people, then and now, never think to ask about. Beneath the plain blue morning gown she chose for breakfast, there were layers most visitors to the house would never see and never think about, though Eleanor herself thought about very little else in the first 20 minutes of her day. A chemise first, soft cotton against the skin, worn thin and pale from countless washings, then drawers, and stockings held with garters just above the knee, the wool ones today rather than the finer cotton pair kept for warmer months. Then the corset, laced from behind, which on most mornings meant standing at the foot of the bed, while Eleanor reached the laces back over her own shoulders and pulled them tight herself, a task that had become, over so many years, almost unconscious in its efficiency, though it had certainly not always been so. She remembers dimly being 14 or 15 and struggling with this same task, arms aching, breath caught awkwardly, a maid at her mother's house eventually summoned to finish the lacing properly. There is no maid for such tasks in this house, not on an ordinary Tuesday morning at least, and Eleanor has long since developed her own quiet method, a particular twist of the wrist, a practiced tug, that gets the whole business done in a few short minutes without assistance. Over the corset came a chemisette, and then the petticoats. 2 of them this morning since the day promised to be cool, layered one over the other, each one a slightly different weight of cotton or flannel depending on the season, and Eleanor's own judgment of what the sky outside seemed to be planning. Only then did the dress itself go on, the dark blue wool settling over everything beneath it, transforming what had been, moments before, a somewhat vulnerable woman standing in her underclothes, into the composed, entirely respectable figure who would preside over breakfast a short while later. I mention all this not because I think you need a full accounting of Victorian underclothes to fall asleep tonight, but because there is something in it worth sitting with for a moment. So much labour, so much careful, repeated, unseen effort went into simply appearing presentable each morning, and almost none of it was ever noticed or remarked upon by anyone outside the room where it happened. Eleanor's husband saw the finished result at breakfast and thought nothing of the 40 minutes that preceded it. This is true of a great deal of what women did and continue to do, work rendered invisible by its very success. There was a particular ache, too, that Eleanor had simply come to accept as the ordinary cost of respectability, a slight tightness across the ribs by mid-afternoon most days. Worse on days she laced herself a little too enthusiastically that morning, better on days she showed herself more mercy. She had learned over the years to lace just tightly enough to hold the correct silhouette without inviting real discomfort, a small daily negotiation between fashion and simple physical tolerance that she rarely thought about consciously anymore, though her body, she suspected, kept a more honest account of the toll than her mind did. Her hair, too, deserves a moment's more attention than I gave it earlier. The style Eleanor wore, parted centrally and drawn back into a low knot at the nape of her neck, had not changed dramatically in perhaps a decade, though the fashions in the ladies' magazines Mrs. Ashworth sometimes lent her showed increasingly elaborate arrangements, curled fringes and high-piled coils that Eleanor privately thought looked rather more suited to an evening ball than to a Tuesday spent managing accounts and calling on the dressmaker. She was not, she told herself, unfashionable exactly, simply practical. A woman of her situation, running a household with limited help, could not afford the hour or more that some of the more elaborate styles seemed to require, nor did she particularly want to. There was a kind of quiet dignity, she thought, in a simple style well executed, rather than a complicated one hastily and imperfectly achieved. Still, she was not entirely immune to vanity, and there were small concessions she allowed herself. A single curl, carefully arranged with a heated iron kept for the purpose, framing her face just so. A ribbon, matched carefully to whatever dress she wore, threaded through the low knot at her neck. These small touches took only a few extra minutes, but made a difference she could feel, if not always articulate, a sense of having presented herself with some care, rather than simply having gotten dressed. The dressing table itself, crowded with pins, and the silver-backed brush, and the small rosewood jewellery box, also held a modest collection of other necessities, a pot of cold cream, kept for the winter months when the wind off the street left her skin dry and reddened, a small bottle of lavender water, applied sparingly to wrists and throat, not perfume exactly, nothing so bold, but a small pleasant note that Eleanor had worn every day since her wedding, a habit begun then that had simply never stopped. A tin of tooth powder, faintly minted, used with a small brush each morning and again at night, a modern habit her own mother had considered rather excessive, but that Eleanor maintained faithfully regardless. There was also, tucked at the very back of one drawer, a small collection of things that had nothing to do with dressing at all. A pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, gone brown and fragile with age but never discarded. A lock of hair, dark and fine, tied with a faded ribbon, that had come from Thomas as an infant, before the fever that nearly took him, kept now less as a keepsake of babyhood, and more as a small private reminder of a danger safely survived. A single letter, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, that Charles had written her during their brief engagement, before either of them had learnt yet how to be married to one another. Eleanor did not look at these things often. Most mornings she simply dressed and moved on to the day's actual business without a second thought for the drawer's quieter contents. But she knew they were there, and there was a comfort in that knowledge alone. The way one might feel comforted simply knowing a particular door in a house is locked, without ever needing to check it. Now, let us go back to that ledger for a moment, the one Eleanor opened at her writing desk while the house settled into its late morning quiet, because household accounts, dull as they might sound, were in many ways the true centre of gravity around which everything else in that house revolved. The ledger itself was a plain leather-bound book, its cover worn soft and slightly stained at one corner from a spilled ink pot some years back, and its pages were ruled into neat columns that Eleanor filled in a small, careful hand every single week without exception. Rent did not appear in these pages, since the house itself belonged outright to Charles, inherited some years before from an uncle whose death Eleanor still remembered with a complicated mixture of genuine grief and quiet gratitude, since without that inheritance the family's situation would have looked considerably less comfortable than it did now. But everything else appeared. The butcher's account, settled monthly rather than paid on the spot, a common enough arrangement between a respectable family and a trusted tradesman, though it required Eleanor to keep careful track of what was owed so that no unpleasant surprise might arrive at the end of the month. The baker, similarly, the coal merchant, whose deliveries grew more frequent and more expensive as autumn deepened toward winter, and whose account Eleanor watched with particular attention each year, remembering all too well a January some years back, when a harsh cold snap had nearly outpaced the family's fuel budget entirely. There was Sarah's small weekly wage, modest but reliable, and the occasional additional payment to a washerwoman who came in on the heaviest laundry days, since even a household as careful as this one could not manage the enormous physical labour of washing linens for 6 people entirely on its own. There were the children's school fees, Thomas's tutor paid by the term, and a smaller sum set aside, though Eleanor rarely mentioned this even to Charles, toward whatever eventual expense Margaret's future might require, whether that meant a wedding or simply the ordinary costs of a young woman's continuing life in her parents' house until such time as she married. Eleanor was, if she allowed herself the small private pride of admitting it, genuinely skilled at this work. She had a memory for prices that Charles frequently marvelled at, could tell within a penny or two what a joint of beef ought to cost that week, based on nothing more than a glance at the butcher's window, and had developed, over 16 years of careful practice, an almost instinctive sense for which small economies were worth making, and which would only make the household feel meaner without actually saving very much. She did not, for instance, economize on the children's food, believing firmly that growing bodies required proper nourishment regardless of what it cost. But she had learnt to be clever about other things, a dress remade rather than replaced, its seams let out or its trim changed to give the appearance of something new, candles used sparingly in rooms where lamps would do just as well, a joint of meat stretched carefully across 2 or even 3 meals, the bones saved always for soup rather than discarded, a habit so deeply ingrained that Eleanor genuinely could not imagine throwing a good bone away, whatever the family's actual financial comfort might currently allow. There had been leaner years. She thought of them sometimes while balancing the columns, not with self-pity exactly, but with a kind of quiet, hard-won wisdom. The year Charles's practice had struggled badly against a wealthier rival solicitor newly arrived in town, when Eleanor had quietly sold a small piece of her own jewellery, a garnet ring from an aunt, without ever telling her husband exactly where the extra funds for that winter's coal had come from. The year Thomas had been so ill with fever that the doctor's visits alone had eaten into savings Eleanor had spent years carefully building, and she remembered lying awake more than one night that winter, doing sums in her head instead of sleeping, terrified less of the immediate cost than of what it meant about how thin their margin for disaster actually was. Charles knew, of course, the broad shape of their finances. He earned the money, understood roughly what it took to run the household, and trusted Eleanor's management of the details in a way that Eleanor had come, over the years, to recognize as a genuine form of respect, even if he rarely stated it so plainly. But he did not know the granular texture of it the way Eleanor did. He did not know, for instance, that she had gone without a new winter coat for 3 years running, patching and retrimming the same dark wool garment each autumn rather than requesting funds for a new one, quietly redirecting that particular expense toward Margaret's wardrobe instead, since a young woman approaching marriageable age needed to be dressed with rather more care than a middle-aged wife whose own appearance mattered considerably less to the household's social standing. This was not martyrdom, exactly, or at least Eleanor did not experience it as such. It was simply arithmetic, the same careful weighing of costs and needs that ran beneath every pleasant surface of the household, mostly invisible, entirely essential. She finished the week's accounts that morning with a small sigh of genuine relief, the columns balancing with a few shillings to spare, and allowed herself, before closing the ledger, one small moment of satisfaction. It was not a grand achievement, balancing a household's books for another ordinary week. No one would ever write it into a history book or hang a portrait to commemorate it, but it was real work, steadily done, and Eleanor closed the ledger's cover with the particular quiet pride of a woman who knows, whatever the wider world might assume about the invisible labor of wives, that the whole comfortable machinery of this house runs, in no small part, because of her own careful, ceaseless attention. The walk into town that afternoon, with Alice's hand in hers, and the dressmaker's shop as the destination, deserves a slower telling too, because the town itself, seen at that unhurried pace, held a great deal more than I described the first time through. The high street ran roughly a quarter-mile from end to end, cobbled and busy with the particular rhythm of a market town going about its ordinary Tuesday business. Eleanor knew nearly every shop by both name and reputation, having lived here the whole of her married life, and there was a comfort in this familiarity that she rarely examined consciously, but that shaped nearly every step of the walk. The chemist's shop, where Mrs. Ashworth had apparently spotted Margaret with the mysterious young man, sat roughly halfway along, its window displaying neat rows of labelled bottles and a hand-painted sign advertising remedies for everything from headache to nervous complaint. The ironmonger's belonged to Mr. Ashworth, and Eleanor gave it a polite nod in passing, though she did not stop, having no particular errand there today. Mrs. Carrow's dress shop sat at the far end, set back slightly from the street, with 3 worn stone steps leading up to its door, and the bell above the entrance gave its familiar small chime as Eleanor pushed inside, Alice trailing close behind her, momentarily subdued by the sheer quantity of interesting fabric on display. The shop smelled of new cloth, and a particular chemical sharpness of dye not entirely settled, and bolts of fabric stood arranged along one wall in a rainbow that shifted gently with the changing seasons, heavier wools and dark plaids giving way, this time of year, to the first pale muslins and lighter cottons of approaching spring. Mrs. Carrow herself, a thin, energetic woman perhaps 10 years Eleanor's senior, emerged from the back room at the sound of the bell, pins still bristling from a small cushion strapped to her wrist. Their conversation about the blue dress went much as I described before, apologies offered and cautiously accepted, a promise of delivery within the week. But Eleanor lingered afterward, as she often did in this particular shop, running her fingers over bolt after bolt of fabric with no real intention of purchasing, simply enjoying the small tactile pleasure of good cloth beneath her hand. There was a deep green wool that caught her eye particularly, heavier than anything suitable for the current season, but lovely all the same, the kind of colour that would suit Margaret beautifully once autumn returned, and Eleanor made a small private note to remember it, though she said nothing aloud to Mrs. Carrow about future orders not yet decided upon. It was the pale green muslin, though, that truly held her attention, as it had the first time she saw it. She had told herself, standing in the shop, that the household accounts did not currently allow for it, and this was true enough. But there was something more beneath that practical refusal, something Eleanor did not examine too closely even in her own private thoughts. The fabric was the exact shade, she realized only as she stood there running it between her fingers, of a dress she had owned once herself, decades ago now, worn during the brief giddy weeks of her engagement to Charles, before either of them had quite understood what marriage would actually ask of them. She had not thought of that particular dress in years. It surfaced now, unbidden, standing in Mrs. Carrow's shop with her own daughter tugging gently at her sleeve, eager to move on to whatever came next in the day. Eleanor set the muslin down at last, smoothing it back into its proper fold on the shelf, and told herself firmly that the memory, pleasant as it was, changed nothing about the household's current budget. Alice, for her part, had grown restless during this small interlude, and tugged again more insistently at her mother's hand, drawing Eleanor's attention to a small display near the shop's front window, a selection of ribbons in every conceivable colour, arranged in careful loops on a wooden stand. Alice's eye had fixed on a particular shade of pale yellow, and she asked, with the direct, unembarrassed hope of a 7-year-old, whether she might have just a small length of it, enough for her doll's hair perhaps, or her own. She was not entirely particular which. Eleanor considered the request for only a moment before agreeing, the ribbon costing next to nothing, and the small pleasure it clearly promised Alice worth considerably more than its actual price. Mrs. Carrow measured out a length with practiced efficiency, cutting it with a small pair of shears kept for exactly this purpose, and Alice clutched the resulting ribbon the entire rest of the walk home, with the fierce, uncomplicated joy that only small children seem able to summon for such small things. This too, Eleanor thought, watching her youngest daughter admire the ribbon for perhaps the 10th time before they had even reached the end of the high street, is a kind of wealth the household accounts could never properly measure. Not the pale green muslin she had denied herself, but this, a child's whole face lit with pleasure over a length of yellow ribbon costing barely a farthing. There were losses in careful economy, certainly, small pleasures set aside for the sake of the larger household's stability, but there were gains too, easily overlooked, that no ledger column could ever properly capture. Mrs. Ashworth's visit that afternoon deserves its own fuller telling too, because there was a whole small ceremony to receiving a caller that I moved through rather quickly before, and it is worth slowing down here, in this particular stretch of the story, to really settle into it. The good china came out for calls like this one, a set that had been a wedding gift from Charles's mother, delicate white porcelain trimmed in a thin band of gold that had faded, over 16 years of careful use, to something closer to pale amber. Eleanor kept it in the sideboard in the dining room, wrapped in soft cloth between uses, and there was a particular pleasure she took in unwrapping each piece before a visit, checking it for chips or cracks, though none had ever actually appeared in all the years she had owned it. The tea itself was a good black blend, not the finest available in town, since that would have seemed an unnecessary extravagance for an ordinary Tuesday call, but a solid, respectable choice that Eleanor kept specifically for visitors, distinct from the plainer tea the family drank at breakfast. She warmed the pot first with a little hot water, swirled and discarded, before adding the leaves properly, a small ritual her own mother had taught her, and that Eleanor performed now almost without conscious thought. The biscuits were homemade, a batch Eleanor had prepared 2 days prior specifically in anticipation of Mrs. Ashworth's promised visit, since it would not do to serve a guest something purchased when homemade would do just as well and cost considerably less. She arranged them now on a small plate with a paper doily beneath, a fussy little touch she privately considered slightly excessive, but that Mrs. Ashworth, she knew from experience, would notice and appreciate. When the bell rang precisely at 3, Eleanor was ready, seated in the parlour with the fire built up just enough to feel welcoming, her needlework set aside on the small table beside her chair, everything arranged to give the impression of a household comfortably, effortlessly prepared for company, though of course a great deal of quiet effort had gone into achieving that particular appearance of effortlessness. Mrs. Ashworth arrived in a walking dress of deep burgundy, rather finer than Eleanor's own dove grey, a small but telling detail that spoke to the slightly greater prosperity of the ironmongery business compared to a solicitor's modest practice. Though neither woman ever remarked on such differences directly, they embraced briefly at the door, the particular light embrace of women who like each other well enough without being truly intimate, and Mrs. Ashworth settled into the chair opposite Eleanor's with the comfortable ease of a frequent visitor. The conversation moved, as I mentioned before, through a wedding 2 streets over, a topic Mrs. Ashworth clearly relished discussing at some length, describing the bride's dress in more critical detail than the poor girl likely deserved, the sleeves too full for current fashion, the veil, in Mrs. Ashworth's considered opinion, rather too short for a woman of her particular height. Eleanor listened with the small, encouraging murmurs required of a good hostess, privately amused by her friend's absolute confidence in matters of taste she had no actual professional qualification to judge. They moved next to the question of the new curate, a Mr. Pemberton, whose marital status had apparently become a topic of considerable speculation among the ladies of the parish. Mrs. Ashworth reported, with the satisfaction of a woman delivering genuinely valuable intelligence, that he had been seen taking tea with a young lady from a neighbouring parish, though whether this indicated an actual engagement or merely a family connection remained, in Mrs. Ashworth's careful assessment, entirely unclear. Eleanor found herself only half listening during this particular stretch of conversation, her mind drifting occasionally to the muslin she had left behind in Mrs. Carrow's shop, to the small unresolved question of Margaret, and whatever quiet drama was unfolding in her daughter's life without Eleanor's full knowledge. She caught herself once or twice nodding at something without having quite registered what Mrs. Ashworth had actually said, and hoped her friend had not noticed the small lapse in attention. It was the biscuits, actually, that briefly brought the conversation somewhere more genuine, Mrs. Ashworth pausing mid-sentence to compliment them with real sincerity, asking whether Eleanor might share the recipe, since her own attempts at the same style always came out somehow denser than intended. Eleanor promised to write it out and send it round, and there was a small, comfortable pause in the conversation while both women simply enjoyed their tea, the kind of easy silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough not to feel obligated to fill every moment with talk. It was into this pause, this small unguarded gap in the afternoon's conversation, that Mrs. Ashworth finally mentioned Margaret and the young man from the bank, delivered almost as an afterthought, a small piece of neighbourhood colour rather than any deliberate attempt to unsettle her friend. "I saw your Margaret outside the chemist's last week," she said, setting down her teacup, speaking with a very presentable young man, a Mr. Farrow, I believe, newly come to town, something to do with the bank on the corner. Eleanor kept her hands steady around her own teacup, though something in her chest had gone suddenly, carefully alert. "Is that so?" she said, her voice carrying nothing more than mild, polite interest, and Mrs. Ashworth, apparently satisfied that she had shared an item of genuine social value, moved the conversation on towards some other small piece of neighbourhood news, entirely unaware of the small internal shift she had just caused in her friend. The remainder of the visit passed pleasantly enough, and Mrs. Ashworth departed a little before 4, gloves pulled carefully back into place, promising to send round that biscuit recipe request properly in writing, rather than trusting it to memory. Eleanor saw her to the door with all the usual warmth, and it was only once the door had closed, the house settling back into its afternoon quiet, that she allowed herself to actually sit with the small, complicated feeling Mrs. Ashworth's casual remark had stirred. There is a rhythm to a household like this one that extends well beyond any single day, and it is worth pausing here, in this quieter stretch of the afternoon, to let you feel the shape of the wider week surrounding this particular Tuesday, because a single day, however carefully told, can only show you so much. Mondays belong to washing, the heaviest and most dreaded task of the domestic calendar, requiring the washerwoman's additional help and turning the small scullery at the back of the house into a steaming, soap-scented chaos from early morning until well past midday. Eleanor generally kept the children well clear of the scullery on washing days, the great copper boiler dangerous for small, curious hands, and she herself spent a good part of every Monday simply managing the logistics of it, ensuring enough hot water, enough soap, enough clean rope strung across the small back garden for the eventual drying of sheets and shirts and Margaret's various petticoats. Tuesdays, today's own particular day, tended toward calls and errands, the kind of lighter domestic work that could be managed alongside visitors and dressmakers' appointments. Wednesdays were given over to baking, the kitchen filled from morning onward with the smell of bread and, depending on the week, whatever cake or biscuit Eleanor had decided the household required. Thursdays belonged to more thorough cleaning, carpets beaten, brass polished, the deeper work of maintaining a house that always, despite everyone's best efforts, seemed to accumulate dust and disorder faster than any single day could properly address. Fridays were market day proper, when Eleanor walked to the larger market square rather than simply the high street shops, comparing prices between competing stallholders with the same careful attention she brought to the household ledger, since even a farthing saved on vegetables added up meaningfully across a full year's accounts. Saturdays were quieter, a half-day for Charles's office, and the family often took a longer walk together in the afternoon if weather permitted, a rare stretch of time when the whole household moved through the world as a single unit rather than scattered across its various separate obligations. Sundays, of course, belonged to church, and to a Sunday dinner more elaborate than the ordinary weekday meals, and to a general sense of rest that Eleanor genuinely treasured, even though the actual labour of preparing that grander Sunday meal fell, as always, primarily on her own careful planning. The kitchen garden at the back of the house deserves its own small mention here too, since it played a quietly significant role in the household's economy that a casual visitor might easily overlook. It was not large, perhaps the size of two good-sized rooms laid end to end, enclosed by a low brick wall that Charles had repaired himself one summer some years back, taking evident satisfaction in a task so different from his usual paperwork. Eleanor tended it herself for the most part, with occasional help from Thomas when he could be persuaded away from his imaginary battles, and it produced, across the changing seasons, a steady supply of vegetables that meaningfully reduced what the family needed to purchase from the greengrocer. There were beds of cabbage and carrot and the earliest spring lettuces just beginning to show now, a row of herbs kept close to the kitchen door for convenient cutting, and a single apple tree in the far corner, old and somewhat gnarled, that Charles's uncle had apparently planted decades before either Eleanor or Charles had ever set foot in the house. Its fruit, when autumn came, went into pies and preserves that lasted well into the winter months, and there was something Eleanor found genuinely moving about eating apples in January that had grown from a tree planted by a man neither she nor her own children had ever actually met. Thomas had, this past summer, taken a brief and intense interest in the garden, convinced for several weeks that he might grow something spectacular enough to win recognition at the small local fete held each August, before his attention wandered, as it generally did, towards some new imaginary campaign requiring his full boyish focus. Eleanor had let him have his few weeks of earnest digging and watering without comment, recognizing it for what it was, a child's genuine, if temporary, enthusiasm, worth encouraging, even knowing it would not last. Alice, too young yet for any real gardening responsibility, mostly used the space for her own private games, and there was a particular spot beneath the apple tree, worn slightly bare of grass from repeated small feet, where she staged what Eleanor understood to be elaborate tea parties for her doll, and whatever other small companions her imagination supplied for the occasion. It occurred to Eleanor sometimes, standing at the kitchen window watching her children move through this small green space, that this narrow strip of garden held nearly as much of the family's actual life as any of the more formally furnished rooms inside the house. It was where Thomas dug for imaginary treasure and fought his imaginary battles. It was where Alice's dolls held court. It was where Eleanor herself, on the rare morning she found a spare half-hour, liked to kneel among the vegetable beds with dirt under her fingernails, a small private pleasure entirely separate from the careful, managed appearance she maintained for the rest of the world. It was later that evening, after Mrs. Ashworth's small revelation had settled into something Eleanor could no longer simply set aside, that the conversation with Margaret finally happened, though not in the manner Eleanor might have planned it, had she planned it at all. Margaret had come down to the kitchen after dinner, ostensibly to fetch a glass of water, though Eleanor suspected, watching her daughter linger a moment too long in the doorway, that something more had actually brought her there. Eleanor was alone at the time, Sarah already gone for the evening, the kitchen quiet except for the low settling sounds of the range cooling after the day's cooking. "Mother," Margaret said, and stopped, and Eleanor, recognizing something in her daughter's tone that asked for patience rather than prompting, simply continued drying the single teacup in her hands and waited. "There is someone," Margaret said finally, the words coming out in a rush now that she had committed to them. "His name is William Farrow. He works at the bank. We have spoken a few times, after church mostly, and I did not tell you because I was not certain there was anything worth telling yet, and I did not want you to worry or to ask questions I could not answer." Eleanor set the teacup down carefully on its shelf before turning to face her daughter properly. "I know," she said gently. "Mrs. Ashworth mentioned seeing you together outside the chemist's." Something crossed Margaret's face at this, not quite alarm, closer to the particular embarrassment of a private matter suddenly revealed to have been public all along. "Everyone knows then," she said, with the faint despair of a 19-year-old convinced her entire private life has been thoroughly exposed to public scrutiny. Eleanor could not quite suppress a small smile at this. "Mrs. Ashworth knows," she said, "which in a town this size amounts to nearly the same thing, I am afraid, but it is not the catastrophe you seem to think it is. There is no shame in a young man walking you home from church, Margaret, provided it is conducted properly, and provided you have not been keeping secrets from me out of fear rather than simple uncertainty." Margaret was quiet a moment, twisting the hem of her sleeve between two fingers in a habit she had carried since childhood, one Eleanor recognized instantly as a sign her daughter was working up to something further. "I did not know how to tell you," she said eventually. "It felt foolish, somehow, to make a great announcement over something that might come to nothing at all, and I suppose I wanted it to be mine, just for a little while, something that belonged only to me, before it became a whole family matter, with father asking questions and you and Mrs. Ashworth discussing it over tea." There was something in this admission that struck Eleanor with unexpected force, a small, sharp recognition of her own younger self, wanting exactly the same thing at exactly the same age, some private corner of her own life not yet claimed by the watchful attention of parents who meant well and asked too many questions regardless. "I understand that better than you might think," she said, and meant it entirely. She reached out and took her daughter's hand, stilling the anxious twisting of the sleeve. "Tell me about him," she said, not as an interrogation, just as your mother, who would genuinely like to know. And so Margaret told her, haltingly at first and then with growing ease, about William Farrow, 23 years old, recently arrived from a bank in the north to take up a position at the local branch, respectable, well-spoken, possessed of a dry sense of humour that had apparently caught Margaret's attention during a chance conversation after church some 6 weeks prior. He had asked, twice now, whether he might call on her properly, and Margaret had put him off both times, uncertain how to raise the subject with her parents, uncertain even whether her own feelings were serious enough to warrant the formality of an official call. Eleanor listened to all of this with real attention, asking small questions here and there, and there was a particular pleasure in it that she had not expected, watching her daughter's face light with the specific animation of someone discussing something that genuinely mattered to her. This is a different Margaret, Eleanor thought, than the one who sits quietly through Mrs. Ashworth's gossip or bickers with Thomas over the last slice of bread. This is a young woman discovering for the first time what it feels like to be truly interested in someone else's presence in the world. When Margaret finished, Eleanor considered her words carefully before responding. "I think," she said, "you should tell your father, not because there is anything wrong in what has happened so far. A few conversations after church are hardly scandalous, but because young men who wish to call properly ought to be permitted to do so properly, and that requires your father's knowledge, at the very least." Margaret nodded slowly, some of the earlier anxiety returning to her expression. "Will he be terribly stern about it?" she asked, and Eleanor found herself laughing softly, a real laugh, at the particular mixture of hope and dread in her daughter's voice. "Your father," she said, "has been dreading this exact conversation since you were approximately 6 years old. He will ask a great many careful questions about Mr. Farrow's prospects and character, and he will likely take rather longer than necessary to arrive at approving, simply because that is his particular way of showing he takes the matter seriously. But he will approve in the end, provided this Mr. Farrow proves himself the sort of young man he appears to be. I have never known your father to stand between you and something that would genuinely make you happy." Margaret's shoulders relaxed visibly at this, some private weight apparently lifted, and she embraced her mother suddenly, an unguarded gesture rarer now than it had been a few years earlier, when such embraces came as easily as breathing. Eleanor held her daughter a moment longer than strictly necessary, feeling in that small embrace the particular bittersweet weight of watching a child step, deliberately and with her own full will, toward a life that would eventually take her out of this house entirely. "Thank you, Mother," Margaret said finally, pulling back, and Eleanor simply nodded, not trusting her voice quite enough in that moment to say anything more. Dinner that evening, after Margaret's small private conversation with her mother in the kitchen, carried a different texture than usual, though only Eleanor and Margaret themselves understood exactly why. Margaret was quieter than her earlier animated confession might have suggested, gathering her courage now for the larger conversation still ahead, the one with her father, and Eleanor found herself watching her daughter across the table with a fond, protective attention that Charles noticed but did not yet understand. There is a particular tradition in this household, one I have not mentioned yet, that belongs specifically to Tuesday evenings, and it happened that night much as it always did, regardless of whatever quieter drama was unfolding beneath the surface of the meal. After the plates were cleared, rather than scattering immediately to their separate evening occupations, the family remained at the table a little longer while Charles read aloud from whatever book currently held his interest, a habit begun years ago when the children were small enough to need bedtime stories, and continued now in modified form, largely because no one in the family had ever quite wanted to let it go. Tonight's selection was a novel of adventure and travel that Thomas had specifically requested weeks before, full of shipwrecks and distant islands that held his complete, rapt attention in a way his Latin lessons never managed to achieve. Charles read with more theatrical flourish than his usual dry courtroom manner might suggest he possessed, dropping his voice for moments of danger, raising it for triumphant escapes, and there was something in watching her husband perform this small nightly service for his children that Eleanor found she loved with an intensity that surprised her every single time she noticed it freshly. Alice, too young really to follow the full plot, listened anyway with wide, serious attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed she had misunderstood some important element entirely, questions Charles answered with patient good humour rather than correction. Margaret listened too, though her attention drifted more than usual tonight, her mind clearly still occupied with William Farrow and the conversation still ahead of her. This tradition, Eleanor reflected, watching her family gathered around the table in the lamplight, was not something she or Charles had ever consciously decided to establish. It had simply grown organically out of years of small bedtime rituals that had gradually shifted and adapted as the children aged, until it had become something none of them could quite imagine the household without. She wondered sometimes whether Margaret, in whatever eventual household of her own, might carry some version of this same tradition forward, reading aloud to children not yet born, in a house not yet chosen, the whole small custom passed down without either Margaret or her own eventual children ever quite knowing where it had originally come from. There was a clock on the mantel in the dining room, a solid, unremarkable thing in dark wood that had belonged to Charles's grandmother, and its steady ticking provided a kind of quiet undercurrent to these evening readings that Eleanor had come to associate so strongly with the ritual itself that she sometimes found herself unable to properly enjoy a book read aloud in a room without a similarly ticking clock nearby. The clock had come to the family, along with the house itself, through Charles's uncle's estate, and Eleanor had learned, over the years, small pieces of its history from Charles's occasional reminiscences. It had apparently stopped entirely for nearly a full year after Charles's grandmother's death, no one in the family quite able to bring themselves to wind it again, until finally a young cousin, visiting for a holiday and unaware of its significance, had simply wound it back into motion without asking anyone's permission, restoring its steady ticking to the household, almost by accident. Eleanor found something quietly moving in this small story every time Charles told it, though he told it rarely and always somewhat reluctantly, as though the memory still carried some private weight he preferred not to examine too closely in company. There was a whole history contained in that ordinary clock, generations of a family Eleanor herself had only married into rather than been born to, and yet she had come, over 16 years, to feel it belonged to her every bit as much as it belonged to Charles, simply through the accumulated weight of so many ordinary evenings spent beneath its steady, familiar ticking. Charles finished the evening's chapter at a suitably dramatic moment. The ship's crew stranded on unknown shores with their fate still uncertain, and closed the book despite Thomas's immediate, vigorous protest. "Tomorrow," Charles said firmly, the same promise he made every single night regardless of how the chapter ended, and Thomas subsided into grudging acceptance, as he did every single night as well, the whole small exchange so familiar now that Eleanor could have predicted every word of it in advance. Margaret found her moment with Charles a little later that same evening, after the younger children had been sent up for their baths, catching her father alone in his study where he had retreated with his pipe and the remainder of the day's newspaper. Eleanor, passing the study door on some small errand of her own, caught only fragments of the conversation, enough to understand its general shape without hearing every word. Charles's voice, when it came, carried the particular gravity he reserved for matters he considered genuinely important, a tone quite different from his usual dry courtroom manner or his theatrical evening readings. There were questions, as Eleanor had predicted, about young Mr. Farrow's position at the bank, about his family background, about his general character and prospects, delivered with the careful thoroughness of a man who had spent his entire professional life learning to ask precisely the right questions before committing to any important judgment. Margaret answered as best she could, her voice carrying across the hall in fragments, earnest and slightly nervous, clearly working hard to present William Farrow in the most favourable possible light without overstating anything she could not actually confirm. Eleanor, lingering perhaps a moment longer near the study door than strict discretion required, felt a familiar swell of tenderness for both of them, her daughter working so hard to make a good case for her own heart's inclination, her husband working equally hard to seem stern and measured, while almost certainly already halfway toward approval, simply because his daughter clearly wished it. She did not stay to hear the conversation's conclusion, retreating instead toward the nursery to oversee the children's baths, but she caught Charles's expression later that night, once both younger children were settled and the house had quieted again, and recognized in it the particular mixture of pride and mild alarm that she suspected every father felt upon first properly confronting the reality that his eldest daughter had grown into a young woman other men might reasonably wish to court. He mentioned it to Eleanor directly once they were alone together in their own bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed working at his cufflinks in the familiar gesture Eleanor knew so well. "She tells me this young Farrow wishes to call on her properly," he said, a faint note of something between amusement and genuine unease colouring his voice. "I confess I had rather hoped we had another year or two before this particular conversation became necessary." Eleanor, already brushing out her hair at the dressing table, met his eyes in the mirror's reflection. "She is 19, Charles," she said gently. "We were married by the time I was her age, if you recall." "That," Charles said, with a small rueful smile, "is precisely the detail I have been trying very hard not to think about all evening." There was real affection beneath the words, and Eleanor understood it completely, this particular paternal reluctance to fully acknowledge that time had moved forward regardless of how carefully a father might wish to hold it still. She recognized something of her own feelings in it too, the strange doubled grief and joy of watching a child step deliberately toward the exact same kind of adult life her parents themselves had built, a life that would eventually, inevitably, take that child out of the family home entirely. "You will let him call, though," Eleanor said, not quite a question, and Charles nodded, setting his cufflinks aside at last. "I will let him call," he confirmed. "I will ask him a great many careful questions when he does, and I will take rather longer to be satisfied than perhaps strictly necessary. But yes, I will let him call." She looked happier tonight than I have seen her look in some months, telling me about him. I could hardly refuse that, whatever careful questions my own nerves might prefer to ask instead. Eleanor set down her hairbrush and crossed the small room to sit beside her husband, resting her head briefly against his shoulder in a gesture as familiar and wordless as any conversation they might have had. They sat like that a moment, two people who had built an entire shared life out of exactly this kind of quiet, undramatic partnership, now facing together the strange new reality that their own careful work of building a family had produced, in Margaret, a young woman fully capable of building one of her own. "Do you remember," Eleanor said eventually, "when you first asked my own father whether you might call on me properly?" Charles gave a short laugh at the memory. "I remember being considerably more terrified than young Mr. Farrow has any right to be of me," he said. "Your father had a way of looking at a young man that suggested he was quietly calculating exactly how much trouble that young man might eventually cause his daughter." "And did he decide correctly?" Eleanor asked, with the particular teasing warmth of a wife entirely secure in the answer already. Charles turned to look at her properly then, 16 years of shared life visible in the small, familiar creases at the corners of his eyes. "I certainly hope not," he said softly, and kissed her forehead, and there was nothing more that either of them needed to say about it. "Let me return now to the children's bedtime, which I moved through rather briefly before, because there is more worth lingering on in that particular hour, especially in Thomas's small, worn possessions, and the particular rituals that had grown up around them over his 11 years of life." Thomas's room, considerably plainer than Margaret's increasingly grown-up chamber, still held the particular clutter of active boyhood, a shelf of adventure novels well beyond their years of use, their spines cracked and their pages softened from repeated eager reading, a wooden sword propped in the corner, the very one that had featured so prominently in that afternoon's imaginary garden battle, its blade nicked and worn from countless similar campaigns. There was also, tucked beneath his pillow where he thought no one noticed it, a small tin soldier missing one arm, a toy so old and so thoroughly beloved that Eleanor could not actually remember when it had first entered the household, whether it had been a gift from some relative now forgotten, or simply accumulated among the general clutter of childhood possessions that arrives in every household without anyone quite tracking its origin. Thomas would have been mortified, at 11, to admit he still slept with it most nights, and Eleanor had long since learnt to say nothing about it, simply smoothing his blankets carefully around the small hidden shape each evening, without comment. Tonight, freshly bathed and considerably calmer than his earlier splashing protests might have suggested he could become, Thomas settled into bed with unusual thoughtfulness, and Eleanor, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed as she often did for a few final minutes before leaving him to sleep, noticed something working behind his eyes that suggested a question building. "Mother," he said finally, "do you think Margaret will actually marry that man from the bank?" Eleanor was mildly startled that word of the evening's developments had already reached her son. Children in a household this size, having their own mysterious channels of information that generally outpaced whatever careful discretion the adults intended. "It is far too early to say anything of the sort," she said carefully. "They have only just begun to know one another properly, but I think, if things continue well, it is certainly possible, some day." Thomas considered this with the particular gravity of an 11-year-old confronting an abstract future concept for the first time. "Will she still live here?" he asked. "Or will she go away entirely?" "If she marries," Eleanor said gently, recognizing the real concern beneath the question, "she will eventually have her own household, yes, somewhere of her own. But that does not mean she disappears from your life, Thomas. It only means her life grows to include something new, alongside everything she already has here with us." Thomas absorbed this in silence for a moment, clearly turning the idea over from several angles before settling on his verdict. "I do not think I shall ever get married," he announced finally, with the absolute conviction of a boy who has just discovered a genuinely troubling implication of adulthood. "It sounds like rather a lot of trouble, having to ask someone's father all sorts of careful questions." Eleanor could not entirely suppress her laughter at this, smoothing his hair back from his forehead in the familiar gesture she had used since he was an infant. "Perhaps you will feel differently in another decade or so," she said, "but there is no need to decide anything tonight. Sleep now." He was asleep, as usual, within a few short minutes of her leaving the room, the small tin soldier no doubt already reclaimed from beneath his pillow the moment he thought himself alone, and Eleanor stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the low light of the single candle she carried, thinking of his blunt, unromantic assessment of marriage with genuine affection. There would be time enough, she thought, for him to discover the more complicated truth of it, the particular steady comfort of a shared life built slowly across years, rather than any single dramatic declaration. He did not need to understand that yet. 11 was still, thankfully, young enough to find the whole business simply a great deal of unnecessary trouble. Alice's room, across the narrow hallway, held its own particular collection of treasured, worn objects, though hers leaned toward the soft and imaginative rather than Thomas's collection of adventure and battle. The rag doll, its face embroidered rather than painted, its yellow yarn hair somewhat thinned from years of affectionate handling, sat propped against Alice's pillow exactly where it belonged each night, a fixed point in her small world that Eleanor suspected mattered more to her youngest daughter's sense of security than any of the more obviously significant household routines. The doll had been a gift from Eleanor's own sister, sent down from the north the winter Alice turned 4, and it had taken, from nearly the first day, a place in Alice's affections that no subsequent toy had ever managed to displace. Alice had named her Dorothy, for reasons she had never satisfactorily explained even when directly asked, and Dorothy had since accompanied her through countless invented adventures, tea parties beneath the apple tree, elaborate dramas involving imaginary kingdoms and imaginary dangers that Eleanor caught only fragments of from the next room, enough to understand that her daughter's imagination ran considerably richer than her quiet, sometimes shy daytime demeanor might suggest to outsiders. Tonight, tucked in with Dorothy already reclaimed to her rightful place, Alice asked for her story with the particular insistence of a child who considers this ritual entirely non-negotiable, regardless of how tired her mother might reasonably be by this hour of a long day. Eleanor obliged, as she always did, drawing on a well-worn repertoire of small invented tales that shifted slightly with each telling, tonight's version involving a rather brave rabbit who had lost his way home in a great forest and had to rely on the kindness of various forest creatures to find his way back before nightfall. Alice listened with the complete, absorbed attention she brought to every story, occasionally interjecting a question or a small suggested improvement, tonight insisting that the rabbit really ought to have a friend named Dorothy who helped him along the way, a request Eleanor incorporated smoothly into the tale's remaining minutes, watching her daughter's eyes grow heavier with each passing sentence, until sleep finally claimed her somewhere in the story's final stretch, before the brave rabbit and his newly invented friend Dorothy had quite managed to find their way home. Let us return now to Eleanor's own bath, the quiet hour I described before, because there is a deeper current of memory running beneath that particular stretch of the evening that deserves more room than I gave it the first time through. Sitting in the cooling water, hair loose down her back, Eleanor found her thoughts drifting, as they sometimes did on evenings when Margaret's own courtship had stirred old memories loose, back toward her own engagement to Charles, nearly 17 years distant now, but still, in certain details, remarkably vivid. She had been 18 when they first met, at a small gathering hosted by a mutual family friend, and she remembered almost nothing useful about the actual evening itself, beyond a general impression of too many people crowded into too small a parlour, and a young solicitor's clerk, barely established in his profession at the time, who had spent rather more of the evening talking with her than propriety strictly required, given they had only just been introduced. Charles at 23 had been leaner than he was now, his dark hair not yet showing the grey that had crept in gradually across their marriage, and he had possessed even then the same careful, deliberate manner of speaking that Eleanor had come to know so intimately over the subsequent years, a habit of considering each sentence fully before delivering it, that some of her friends had found rather dull but that Eleanor herself had found, from nearly that first evening, quietly reassuring. Here was a man, she remembered thinking with the particular clarity of an 18-year-old convinced she understood a great deal more about people than she actually did, who did not say things carelessly, who meant what he said and said what he meant. Their courtship, by the standards of the more dramatic novels Eleanor had devoured at Margaret's current age, had been almost embarrassingly unremarkable. There had been no great crisis, no dramatic obstacle, no sweeping declaration delivered beneath a stormy sky. Charles had simply called with increasing regularity across the better part of a year, had asked eventually whether he might speak with her father and Eleanor's father, after the customary careful questions about prospects and character that Charles himself now found himself dreading having to pose to young Mr. Farrow, had given his blessing without any particular drama attached to the decision. She remembered the actual proposal itself with more clarity than almost anything else from that entire year, not because it had been especially romantic in the manner her younger self might once have hoped for, but because of its particular, characteristic Charles quality, delivered not on bended knee in some picturesque garden, but during an entirely ordinary afternoon walk, Charles stopping mid-sentence about something entirely unrelated to announce, with the same careful deliberation he brought to every important statement, that he had given the matter a great deal of thought, and believed they would suit one another very well as husband and wife, should she be agreeable to the arrangement. She had laughed, she remembered, not from any lack of feeling, but from sheer surprise at the sheer practical, unromantic delivery of what ought to have been the most romantic moment of her young life, and Charles had looked so genuinely alarmed by her laughter that she had needed to reassure him rather quickly that she was in fact entirely agreeable to the arrangement, laughter and all. It occurred to her now, sitting in the cooling bath water 17 years later, that this particular story had become something of a small family legend over the years, told and retold at various points, Margaret and even young Thomas having heard some version of it enough times to recite the basic outline themselves. But Eleanor rarely allowed herself to actually sit inside the memory itself the way she was doing tonight, to really feel again the particular quality of that autumn afternoon, the specific texture of Charles's nervous, careful proposal, the enormous, slightly terrifying weight of the decision she had made in that single unremarkable moment on an unremarkable walk, the wedding itself. Some months later, she remembered in fragments rather than whole scenes, the particular cold of the church that morning, the weight of her mother's own wedding veil, carefully altered to fit, resting on her hair, the strange, dreamlike sensation of walking down an aisle toward a life she could not yet fully imagine, however much careful preparation had gone into imagining it. She remembered her father's hand steady beneath her own trembling one, and Charles's face at the altar, similarly nervous despite his usual careful composure, and the particular moment, easy to overlook amid all the ceremony, when their eyes had actually met properly for the first time that day, and something in his expression had settled her own nerves more effectively than any of the careful words spoken by the officiating minister. There had been a wedding breakfast afterward, modest but warm, held in her parents' own home rather than anywhere grander, and Eleanor remembered almost nothing of the actual food served, only the general warm blur of well-wishing relatives and the particular strange sensation of being, for the first time in her life, referred to by a new name, Mrs. Whitmore, spoken by people who had known her exclusively as Miss Bradley for the entire 18 years preceding that single afternoon, she thought, sitting now in her cooling bath with her own daughter's fresh courtship unfolding just down the hall, about how strange it was that this entire enormous transformation from Miss Bradley to Mrs. Whitmore, from one entire life into another, had felt, at the time, both overwhelming and somehow entirely natural, as though she had simply been walking steadily toward this exact point her whole life, without quite realizing it until she actually arrived. Margaret would feel something similar, perhaps, whenever her own wedding day eventually arrived, whether to young Mr. Farrow or to someone else entirely should this particular courtship not ultimately prove the right one. Eleanor hoped, sitting there in the quiet, firelit privacy of her own bathroom, that her daughter's version of that overwhelming natural transformation would prove as steady and as genuinely happy as her own had, across all the years since, turned out to be. I mentioned earlier, only in passing, the winter Thomas fell ill with fever, and I think it is worth returning to that memory now, gently, because it shaped a great deal of how Eleanor moved through the world afterward, even years later, even on an entirely ordinary Tuesday like the one we have been following. He had been perhaps 4 years old at the time, and the illness itself, whatever its precise medical nature, had settled over the household for the better part of 2 weeks, with a heaviness Eleanor still remembered more through feeling than through specific detail. The doctor had called nearly every day during the worst of it, a kindly, tired-looking man whose visits Eleanor had come to dread and long for in equal measure, dread for what he might report, long for the simple reassurance of another set of experienced eyes assessing her son's condition. She did not like to dwell on the worst of those days even now, and she generally did not, keeping the memory folded away much as she kept the small lock of Thomas's infant hair tucked at the back of her dressing-table drawer, present but rarely examined directly. What she remembered most clearly, when she did allow herself to think of it, was not fear exactly, though there had been plenty of that, but the particular quality of the nights, sitting beside Thomas's small bed with a single candle for light, listening to his breathing with an attention so complete that she had, for those 2 weeks, barely slept herself, catching only brief, shallow rests in the chair beside him, rather than her own proper bed. Charles had sat with her some nights, and worked late at the office pretending to focus on his usual cases other nights, since someone needed to keep the household's income steady even during a crisis, and Eleanor had never resented this necessary division of labor, understanding even then that his way of managing fear was different from her own, but no less real for being less visible. The fever had broken eventually, on a night Eleanor still remembered with a clarity that surpassed almost every other single memory from those 2 difficult weeks, a sudden dampness on Thomas's small forehead that the doctor, called immediately despite the late hour, had pronounced with evident relief to be the crisis finally passing rather than worsening. She remembered weeping that night in a manner she rarely allowed herself, relief and exhaustion and 2 weeks of carefully suppressed terror all arriving at once, and Charles holding her through it without saying very much at all, understanding in that moment that no words were actually required. This memory surfaced now, on this ordinary Tuesday, watching healthy, boisterous Thomas sleep soundly in his own bed with his small hidden tin soldier tucked beneath his pillow, and Eleanor found herself, as she often did when this particular memory returned, simply standing a moment longer in his doorway than strictly necessary, watching the steady, unremarkable rise and fall of his chest with a gratitude that never entirely faded, however many years passed since that difficult winter. There is a particular kind of vigilance that motherhood teaches, Eleanor thought, one that never fully switches off even on the most ordinary of days. She had spent that entire Tuesday managing accounts and calling on dressmakers and receiving Mrs. Ashworth's careful gossip, and beneath all of it, mostly unnoticed even by herself, had run this same quiet watchfulness, checking Thomas's scratched hand at tea, noting Alice's slightly too pale cheeks before deciding they signified nothing more than an ordinary tired child, the whole invisible machinery of a mother's attention running constantly, tirelessly, beneath the visible surface of an entirely unremarkable day. She thought too of how differently she might have told this whole day's story to an outsider, had anyone asked. A pleasant enough Tuesday, she might have said, breakfast, some correspondence, a call from Mrs. Ashworth, dinner with the family. Nothing remarkable happened at all, and yet beneath that flat, ordinary summary ran an entire private world. Margaret's careful courtship finally revealed, Charles's tender paternal unease, Thomas's blunt 11-year-old philosophy on marriage, Alice's invented rabbit and her devoted worn doll named Dorothy, and underneath all of it, this same old memory of a fever finally breaking on a difficult winter night years before, still capable of catching Eleanor by surprise with its sharp, grateful ache even now, even on a Tuesday that had otherwise contained nothing more dramatic than a delayed blue dress and a plate of homemade biscuits. This, she thought, settling finally into her own bed beside her now sleeping husband, is what an entire life actually consists of, not the dramatic crises, though those come too, and leave their own permanent mark. Mostly, it is this. Small ordinary days, one after another, each one carrying its own quiet private weight that no outside observer would ever fully guess at simply from watching a woman manage her household accounts or receive an afternoon caller. The whole enormous complicated business of loving 4 particular people through 16 years of ordinary Tuesdays, this was Eleanor's actual life's work, however invisible it remained to the wider world beyond her own front door. There is something worth lingering on now, in this quiet late stretch of the night, about the house itself, its particular textures of light and warmth, since a house like this one, however ordinary it might seem, held its own small daily rituals around heating and lighting that shaped nearly every hour Eleanor and her family moved through it. The fires themselves required constant, careful management, a task that fell mostly to Sarah during the day, but that Eleanor herself took over each evening, banking the coals down properly before bed so they might be coaxed back to full flame the following morning without needing to be entirely relaid. There was a particular skill to this, one Eleanor had developed slowly over years of practice, judging exactly how much coal to leave smouldering, how tightly to bank the ash around it, so that a spark might still be found glowing faintly beneath the grey the following dawn, rather than having gone entirely cold overnight. Different rooms held different priorities in this careful nightly calculation. The parlour fire, used most heavily during the day for receiving callers like Mrs. Ashworth, could be allowed to die down more completely overnight, since no one occupied that room until well into the following morning. The nursery fire, by contrast, needed the most careful tending, since Eleanor could not bear the thought of either younger child waking cold in the deep hours of the night, and she often found herself, even now, rising once in the middle hours to check its state, adding a careful shovel of coal if the glow had faded more than she liked, a small ritual so habitual she sometimes performed it in a state closer to sleepwalking than full waking attention. The lamps, too, required their own careful economy. Paraffin was not especially costly, but it was not free either, and Eleanor had learned over the years exactly which rooms needed a lamp lit at any given hour, and which could manage well enough on firelight alone, or simply went dark once their purpose for the evening had passed. The dining room lamp, brought out for the family's evening reading, burned brightest and longest of any in the house, since Charles insisted, reasonably enough, on sufficient light for his theatrical performances of whatever adventure novel currently held Thomas's attention. Her own bedroom, by contrast, generally made do with a single candle, sufficient for the quiet work of undressing and brushing out her hair, extinguished promptly once she and Charles had settled for the night, since burning a lamp through the small hours, for no purpose beyond habit, struck Eleanor as exactly the kind of small, avoidable waste that, multiplied across every night of a full year, could meaningfully affect the household's careful budget. There was a particular quality to candlelight that Eleanor had come, over the years, to genuinely prefer to the brighter, steadier light of the lamps, something in its small, flickering warmth that suited the quiet, private hour before sleep far better than the more business-like illumination required for daytime tasks. She liked watching the shadows it threw across the bedroom's familiar furniture, the wardrobe and the dressing table, and the small framed photographs arranged along its surface, each object taking on a slightly different, softer character in that unsteady golden light than it wore during the plainer hours of full day. The whole house, in fact, seemed to Eleanor to hold this same quality of shifting character depending on the hour and its particular light. By day, filled with the ordinary bustle of children and correspondence and callers, it felt almost entirely practical, a machine for living rather than a place of any particular beauty. But in these late hours, fires banked low, a single candle carried from room to room, it took on something closer to the character Eleanor imagined it must have held for Charles's uncle, the previous owner, in his own quiet, solitary years here before Charles and Eleanor and their eventual 4 children had filled it with new noise and new life. She thought sometimes, in these late hours, of the house's whole accumulated history, generations of a family she had married into rather than been born to, and yet whose accumulated small objects, the mantel clock, the dressing table's silver-backed brush, even the very walls themselves, had become, over 16 years, as thoroughly her own as anything she had brought into the marriage from her own girlhood home. There was something quietly moving in this, she thought, the way a house absorbed and held the lives lived within it, layer upon layer, so that even after Charles's uncle's death, even after Eleanor's own eventual passing, whenever that distant, unimaginable day might come, something of both of them would likely remain here still, folded invisibly into the walls and the furniture and the particular worn places on the stairs, where countless feet, across countless years, had gradually shaped the wood to their passage. Let me tell you more about those photographs on the parlour mantel, the ones I mentioned only briefly before. because each one held its own small story, and together they formed a kind of quiet visual record of the entire family's life that Eleanor found herself studying more closely than usual in these later hours of reflection. The wedding portrait sat centermost, as it always had, Eleanor and Charles rigid and solemn in their formal poses, both of them looking, as Eleanor had noted before, almost comically young and serious to her present eyes. Beside it stood a smaller photograph, taken perhaps 2 years into their marriage, showing Eleanor with an infant Margaret in her arms, the baby's face slightly blurred from having moved during the long exposure required by the photographer's equipment, a small imperfection that Eleanor had come to love rather than regret, since it captured something true about babies that a perfectly still image never could have managed: their essential restlessness, their refusal to hold anything, even for a photograph, entirely still. There was a photograph of Charles's parents too, taken some years before their deaths, both now some years gone, formal and somewhat stern-looking, in the manner of an older generation's photographic conventions, though Charles had always insisted, whenever the children asked, that his father had actually possessed a considerable sense of humour entirely absent from his photographed expression. Eleanor had never met either of Charles's parents herself, both having died before her marriage, and she found herself sometimes studying their photographed faces with a peculiar mixture of familiarity and strangeness, recognizing certain features she saw echoed in Charles's own face, in Thomas's growing frame, while remaining permanently unable to actually know these two people who had, nonetheless, shaped so much of the household she now inhabited. A smaller photograph, more recent, showed all 4 children together, taken perhaps 2 years prior, on a rare family excursion, to have a formal portrait made, Margaret standing tall and slightly self-conscious at 17, Thomas scowling at having been made to sit still for so long, Alice, then only 5, caught mid-fidget with her small hands not quite folded properly in her lap as instructed. Eleanor loved this particular photograph precisely for its imperfections, the scowl, the fidget, the whole small evidence of 4 real, specific children rather than some idealized formal arrangement, and she found herself smiling faintly at it now, thinking of how much had changed in just those 2 years, Margaret grown from a self-conscious 17-year-old into a young woman with her own private courtship, Thomas's scowl replaced now by his blunt 11-year-old philosophy on the troublesome business of marriage, Alice's fidgeting energy redirected now into elaborate invented dramas involving a rabbit and a doll named Dorothy. There was one further photograph, set slightly apart from the others, smaller and older than the rest, showing Eleanor's own mother as a young woman, taken decades before Eleanor herself had even been born, a portrait Eleanor had inherited only after her mother's death and had kept, ever since, in a place of particular honour on the mantel, despite its slightly faded, water-stained condition. She looked at this one longest, tonight, tracing with her eyes a face that was simultaneously entirely familiar, since Eleanor herself had inherited something of its particular shape around the eyes, and entirely unknowable, a young woman captured decades before motherhood, or marriage, or any of the experiences that would eventually shape her into the mother Eleanor actually remembered. There was a particular melancholy in this kind of looking, Eleanor thought, studying a young woman who did not yet know what her own future held, who could not have imagined, standing for that long-ago photograph, the specific daughter who would one day study her image with such careful attention, decades after her own death, in a parlour in a house she herself had never visited, belonging to a family she would never meet. But there was comfort in it too, a kind of continuity that Eleanor found genuinely sustaining on nights when the accumulated weight of running a household and raising 4 children and managing a marriage across 16 years threatened to feel, briefly, like rather a lot to carry alone. She was not alone, not really, whatever the particular solitude of these late-night hours sometimes made her feel. She stood in a long line of women, her own mother before her, whoever that woman's own mother had been before that, stretching back further than any surviving photograph could record, each of them managing their own households, raising their own children, carrying their own quiet, largely invisible labour forward into each new generation. Someday, she thought, setting the small collection of frames carefully back in their accustomed places, there would be a photograph of herself on some future mantel, studied by some future daughter or granddaughter with this same complicated mixture of familiarity and distance, a woman captured at some specific moment who could not have imagined the particular life that would eventually unfold from that single frozen instant. It was a strange thought to sit with, this late at night, but not, Eleanor decided, an unwelcome one. There was something almost comforting in imagining herself as simply one more link in this same long unbroken chain, her own particular Tuesday, however ordinary it had felt while she lived through it, becoming, eventually, part of some larger family story that would continue long after she herself had become nothing more than a photograph on someone else's mantle. The season outside deserves its own small mention here too, since the particular character of a day like this one, cool and grey with the first tentative promises of spring, shaped nearly everything about how the household moved through its hours, though in ways so woven into the ordinary fabric of the day that Eleanor rarely stopped to notice them directly. It was, this particular week, still early enough in the year that the fires needed tending morning and night both, and Eleanor had not yet packed away the heavier wool garments in favour of anything lighter, though she had begun, this past fortnight, the familiar seasonal task of airing out the summer dresses stored through winter in the cedar-lined chest at the foot of her wardrobe, checking each one carefully for moth damage before deciding which might be brought back into rotation for the warmer months, still some weeks distant. There was a particular rhythm to these seasonal transitions that Eleanor had come, over 16 years in this same house, to know almost as well as she knew the rhythm of any single day. Spring meant the kitchen garden's slow awakening, the first tender lettuce and the earliest hopeful shoots of what would eventually become a full summer's vegetables, and it meant, too, a gradual lightening of the household's whole mood. Windows opened for the first time in months to air out rooms grown slightly close and stale across the long winter confinement. Summer, when it properly arrived, would bring longer days and correspondingly longer hours of activity, the children spending more time outdoors, Eleanor's own work shifting toward the heavier labour of preserving the garden's eventual bounty, jams and pickles and the careful bottling of fruit that would, come winter, provide exactly the kind of comfort a cold January required. Autumn brought its own particular tasks, the harvest properly gathered in, the apple tree's yield transformed into the pies and preserves that lasted, carefully rationed, well into the following spring, and the whole household beginning its slow retreat back indoors as the days shortened and the fires once again became a daily necessity rather than an occasional comfort. Winter, the hardest season by any practical measure, nonetheless held its own particular pleasures that Eleanor had come to value precisely because they existed in such deliberate contrast to the season's difficulties. There was something about a properly cold January evening, the whole family gathered close around a well-tended fire, that produced a kind of intimacy the more scattered activities of summer rarely managed to match. Charles's evening readings felt somehow more essential in winter, the small circle of lamplight and firelight drawing the family physically closer together against the dark and cold pressing at the windows from outside. Eleanor found herself standing now at her own bedroom window before finally settling for the night, looking out at the dark street below, and thinking of how many of these seasonal cycles she had already witnessed from this exact window, 16 full turns of the year, each one carrying its own particular texture of joys and difficulties, and how many more, she wondered, might still lie ahead. Margaret's own eventual wedding, whenever it came, would fall in some particular season that Eleanor could not yet predict, and she found herself already, this early in whatever courtship might or might not fully develop with young Mr. Farrow, imagining the particular character such an occasion might hold, depending on when it eventually arrived. A summer wedding, bright and full of the garden's own flowers cut fresh that morning, or perhaps an autumn one, the kind of golden, slightly melancholy light that suited, somehow, the bittersweet nature of a mother watching her eldest daughter step properly into her own separate adult life. She caught herself getting ahead of events that had not yet actually happened, smiling faintly at her own imagination's eagerness to race forward into a future still entirely uncertain, and drew the curtain closed against the cool night air, the particular ordinary practical gesture of ending one more day among the many hundreds she had already spent in this same house, watching these same seasons turn, and the many hundreds still, God willing, to come. Let me return to that stack of correspondence Eleanor worked through at her writing desk that morning, because letters held a particular importance in a household like this one that is perhaps easy to overlook from a more modern vantage point, accustomed as we have become to swifter, less deliberate forms of communication. Her sister's letter, the one from up north full of news about nephews and nieces Eleanor had not seen in over a year, deserved rather more attention than the brief mention I gave it earlier. Her sister, Caroline, had married a farmer some years before Eleanor's own wedding to Charles, and had settled into a life considerably more rural and considerably more physically demanding than Eleanor's own, raising 5 children on a working farm where the daily labour left little time for the kind of careful household management Eleanor herself practiced. The 2 sisters had once been close as girls, sharing a bedroom and countless private confidences through their shared childhood, but distance and the sheer weight of their separate adult responsibilities had gradually thinned their contact down to these periodic letters, arriving perhaps once a month, each one carrying news that felt, by the time it reached Eleanor's hands, already several weeks old. Eleanor read this particular letter twice through before setting it aside to answer, once quickly to catch the general shape of Caroline's news, and once more slowly, savouring the specific details her sister had chosen to include: a nephew's first successful attempt at milking a cow entirely unsupervised, a niece's stubborn refusal to wear the bonnet Caroline had carefully made for her, small domestic dramas that felt, despite the very different texture of Caroline's rural life, deeply familiar to Eleanor's own experience of raising children through their various small rebellions and triumphs. There was a particular kind of intimacy in letter writing that Eleanor had come to value precisely because it demanded such careful, deliberate attention, quite unlike the easy, unconsidered chatter of an ordinary conversation. A letter could not be taken back once sent, could not be softened by a following remark or a change of expression, and Eleanor found herself composing her reply to Caroline that morning, weighing each sentence with real care, wanting to convey not simply the bare facts of her own household's news, but something of its actual texture and feeling: Margaret's coming of age, Thomas's boisterous energy, Alice's invented dramas, in language that might make her distant sister feel, even briefly, as though she had actually visited, rather than merely read a report. She mentioned, in this particular letter, nothing yet of Margaret's courtship with young Mr. Farrow, the matter still too new and too uncertain to commit properly to paper, though she suspected her next letter, whenever circumstances made it appropriate, would carry considerably more news on that particular front. There was a discipline to this kind of restraint that Eleanor had learned over years of correspondence, understanding that a letter, once sent, became a kind of permanent record in a way that spoken gossip never quite did, and that certain matters deserved to settle properly into their eventual shape before being committed to a form so difficult to later revise or retract. The note from Mrs. Ashworth, proposing Thursday's call, required only the briefest of replies, a simple confirmation delivered in Eleanor's neat, upright hand, though even this small note received more careful attention than its brevity might suggest. Eleanor, conscious that even the most minor correspondence between respectable households carried its own small implicit judgments about the writer's education and breeding, the quality of the hand, the correctness of the phrasing, small details that mattered rather more in this world than they might seem to warrant on their own modest terms. The invitation to the following week's evening gathering, the third piece of correspondence waiting on her desk that morning, prompted its own small private calculation, since accepting meant committing not only her own evening, but Charles's as well, and meant, too, the small but real expense of appearing appropriately dressed for whatever level of formality the occasion demanded. Eleanor turned the invitation over once or twice, considering, before setting it aside to discuss with Charles that evening, rather than answering immediately, a small habit of deference that had developed naturally over their marriage, not because Charles particularly cared about the details of most such invitations, but because Eleanor had learned that even small decisions felt better made together, a habit of partnership that extended even into matters as minor as which evening gatherings the family might or might not attend. There is something Eleanor found herself thinking, sealing her completed replies with the familiar warm scent of melting wax, about the whole slow, deliberate rhythm of a correspondence-based world, compared to whatever faster forms of communication future generations might eventually develop. A letter took days to arrive, days more to be answered, weeks sometimes for a full exchange to properly complete itself, and there was, in this enforced slowness, a kind of discipline that Eleanor suspected she would genuinely miss should some faster method ever replace it. You could not, after all, simply blurt out an unconsidered thought and send it instantly across the country. You had to sit and think and choose your words, and this slowness, whatever its practical inconvenience, produced a particular kind of thoughtfulness that Eleanor valued more than she could easily articulate, even to herself. I want to speak plainly now for a moment about Eleanor's tiredness, because I have mentioned it once or twice already in passing, and I think it deserves rather more honest attention than a passing mention allows, particularly for anyone listening tonight who recognizes something of their own daily experience in it. Whatever the considerable distance in time between Eleanor's world and your own, it was not a dramatic exhaustion, the kind that might prompt a doctor's visit or a period of enforced rest. It was smaller than that, and in some ways more persistent, a low, steady weariness that accumulated across the ordinary demands of a single day, and that Eleanor had, across 16 years of marriage and motherhood, learned to simply carry rather than address directly, since addressing it would have required a kind of pause the household's needs rarely permitted. It showed itself in small ways mostly. A particular heaviness behind her eyes by the middle of the afternoon, worse on days like today that combined the mental labour of the household accounts with the physical labour of walking into town and the emotional labour of receiving Mrs. Ashworth's careful gossip and, eventually, Margaret's nervous confession, a slight ache across her shoulders by evening, the accumulated tension of a day spent holding 100 small responsibilities in careful, simultaneous balance, a tendency by the time she finally reached her own bed each night to feel her mind still moving through tomorrow's necessary tasks, even as her body begged for the release of actual sleep. Eleanor did not resent this tiredness, exactly, though there were certainly moments, rare and private, when something closer to resentment did briefly surface, usually late at night, usually when some particular small crisis, a torn dress, a disputed household bill, an unexpected caller arriving just as she had finally sat down with her own book, reminded her how entirely her own day belonged to everyone else's needs before it belonged to her own. She thought, sometimes, of what her own days might look like structured differently, though she rarely allowed herself to dwell long on such thoughts, recognizing them as a kind of luxury that served no practical purpose beyond stirring up feelings she had no real means of acting upon. What would it be like, she wondered occasionally, to wake without immediately calculating the day's necessary tasks, to read a full book through in a single sitting rather than a stolen half-hour here and there, to simply exist for an entire day as herself alone, rather than as wife, mother, household manager, correspondent, and hostess all at once. But these thoughts, when they arose, rarely lingered long, crowded out by the more immediate, more genuine pleasures that ran alongside the tiredness in equal, if less frequently acknowledged, measure. There was real pleasure in watching Thomas devour his father's evening reading with such complete absorption, real pleasure in Alice's small, uncomplicated joy over a length of yellow ribbon, real pleasure even in the particular satisfaction of a well-balanced household ledger, evidence of her own genuine competence at work she rarely received any outside recognition for at all. And there was Margaret's confession tonight, that small unguarded moment of real connection between mother and daughter that Eleanor would not have traded for any amount of additional rest, however genuinely her body craved it. This, she thought, settling finally into bed beside her already sleeping husband, was perhaps the central, complicated truth of the particular life she had built, that the very same relentless demands that exhausted her so thoroughly by the end of most days were also, without exception, the precise source of everything she found most genuinely meaningful about her existence. The tiredness and the love were not, she had come to understand across 16 years of practice, actually separate things at all. They were, more truthfully, the very same thing, experienced simply from two different angles depending on the particular hour of the day. There was a particular small pleasure, too, that Eleanor allowed herself most nights, one she had never mentioned to Charles or to anyone else, a brief, private minute or two once the candle was extinguished and the room had settled into full darkness, when she simply lay still and let her mind go entirely quiet, holding no task, no worry, no responsibility at all, just the plain physical fact of her own body finally at rest after a long day's careful management of everyone else's needs. It was not sleep yet in this brief minute, but it was close to it, a kind of suspended stillness that Eleanor had come to treasure precisely because it belonged to no one but herself, unwitnessed, unrequired, entirely private. Tonight, that particular minute arrived a little later than usual. Margaret's confession and Charles's tender unease, and the whole accumulated weight of the day's smaller moments still settling slowly into their proper places in her tired mind. But it arrived eventually, as it always did, and Eleanor let herself sink into it fully, that brief, precious minute of belonging to no one, before sleep itself finally, gently claimed her. Let me widen the frame a little, before we return to Eleanor and her now settled household, because there is another life woven quietly through this entire day that I have mentioned only briefly so far, and it deserves its own proper telling. Sarah, the girl who came in most mornings to help with the heavier work, was 19 herself, the same age as Margaret, though her own life ran along an entirely different course from her employer's daughter, a fact that neither young woman ever discussed directly, but that shaped in 100 small unspoken ways the whole daily texture of their shared household. Sarah lived with her own mother, a widow, in a smaller house on the far side of town, considerably plainer than the Whitmore household, where every penny of Sarah's modest weekly wage went directly toward rent and food, rather than toward the kind of small pleasures, novels and hair ribbons and dressmakers' fittings that filled Margaret's own days. She rose earlier than Eleanor herself, walking the better part of a mile each morning to arrive at the Whitmore house before the family properly woke, and she left each evening only once the heaviest of the day's work was finished, the fires laid for the following morning, the kitchen set right after dinner's preparation. Eleanor thought of Sarah with genuine, if imperfect, kindness, paying her wage promptly and without the petty deductions some households in town were known to practice, and taking real care, over the years, to ensure Sarah was fed properly during her working hours and treated with basic courtesy rather than the careless dismissiveness some mistresses showed toward their household help. But Eleanor was also honest enough with herself, in her more reflective moments, to recognize the considerable gulf that nonetheless separated her own daughter's life from Sarah's, a gulf neither of them had chosen and neither of them could easily cross, built from circumstances of birth that had nothing to do with either young woman's own particular character or effort. Margaret, this same age, spent her mornings reading sentimental novels and considering the delicate question of whether a young man's attention constituted a genuine courtship. Sarah spent hers scrubbing floors and hauling water and coal, work that left her hands, Eleanor had noticed more than once, considerably rougher and redder than her own daughter's carefully tended ones. Margaret would, in all likelihood, marry into some degree of continued comfort, whether to young Mr. Farrow or to some other similarly respectable young man, her own eventual household run, much as her mother's was now, with the help of some future Sarah of her own. Sarah's own path forward looked considerably less certain, dependent on finding a husband capable of supporting her or continuing indefinitely in service, or some combination of both should fortune prove kind or unkind in whatever particular way it chose. Eleanor did not dwell on these disparities constantly, the daily press of her own considerable responsibilities leaving little room for extended philosophical reflection on the broader structures of a world she had, after all, no real power to alter. But she thought of it sometimes, watching Sarah's careful, practiced efficiency moving through tasks that would have exhausted Eleanor's own less calloused hands within an hour, and she felt, in these moments, a complicated mixture of gratitude for her own considerably easier circumstances and a genuine, if largely unexpressed, respect for the sheer physical resilience Sarah's own harder life had built into her. There had been a moment, some years back, when Sarah herself had fallen briefly ill, nothing so severe as Thomas's own fever, but enough to keep her from work for the better part of a week, and Eleanor had sent round a basket of food to Sarah's mother's house without being asked, a small gesture she had never mentioned to anyone, including Charles, since it felt somehow improper to expect credit for what struck her as simply the basic decent thing to do. Sarah had thanked her rather formally upon her return to work, the careful, slightly stiff gratitude of someone unused to such attention from an employer, and the two of them had never discussed the matter again, though Eleanor liked to think something in their working relationship had shifted slightly afterward, a small mutual recognition passing between them that neither would ever put fully into words. Tonight, as every night, Sarah had gone home hours before, walking that same mile back to her mother's smaller house through streets grown properly dark now, and Eleanor found herself thinking of her briefly, this last thought of the day, wondering whether Sarah's own evening held anything resembling the particular warmth of the Whitmore household's shared reading, the fire, the family gathered close. Perhaps it did, in its own different way, a widow and her working daughter finding their own small comforts in circumstances considerably harder than Eleanor's own. She hoped so, genuinely, before her thoughts finally turned back toward her own sleeping household, and the last small tasks remaining before her own long day might, at last, properly end. Let me tell you a little more about Charles's own working life too, since I have mostly kept our attention on the household itself, and there is a whole separate world he inhabited each day, one Eleanor herself never directly witnessed but understood well enough through years of his own careful, measured descriptions over the dinner table. His office sat above a stationer's shop on a side street just off the main high street. 2 rooms, really, an outer chamber where his clerk, a quiet young man named Perkins, managed correspondence and appointments, and an inner room, Charles's own, lined floor to ceiling with legal volumes bound in dark leather that had grown, over the years of his practice, to feel less like furnishing and more like the actual walls of the room itself. Charles had built this practice slowly, almost entirely from nothing, having inherited no established client base from any family predecessor in the profession, and there was a particular pride he took in this fact, rarely stated outright but visible in the careful, methodical way he approached every single case that came before him, however modest its scale. He handled, mostly, the ordinary legal business of a market town, property disputes like the one currently occupying so much of his attention, wills and small estates, occasional matters of debt or minor contract disagreement between local tradesmen, work that rarely made for dramatic dinner-table conversation but that required, nonetheless, real skill and real integrity to conduct properly. There had been, early in his career, a period of real financial precarity that Eleanor remembered with more clarity than Charles himself perhaps realized. The first 2 or 3 years of their marriage, when clients had come slowly and uncertainly, and Eleanor had managed the household accounts through some genuinely difficult stretches, the same careful economy she still practiced now, though the stakes had felt considerably sharper then, before Charles's practice had established the steady, if modest, reputation it now enjoyed. He worked long hours, generally, leaving each morning shortly after breakfast, and rarely returning before 6, and Eleanor had learned, across 16 years, to recognize the particular quality of his exhaustion on different kinds of days, a satisfied, productive tiredness on days when some case had resolved well, a heavier, more troubled quality on days like this current property dispute, when the law itself seemed to offer no clean resolution, and Charles found himself, as he had confessed rather ruefully at dinner, growing increasingly frustrated with 2 neighbouring farmers who seemed more interested in prolonging their grievance than in actually settling it. Eleanor understood, without ever having studied law herself, a fair amount about the particular demands of Charles's profession, simply through years of half-absorbed dinner conversation and the occasional evening spent listening to him think aloud about some particularly knotty legal question, using her, she suspected, less as a source of actual legal insight and more as a patient sounding board against which he could test and refine his own developing arguments. She did not mind this role at all, finding a genuine if modest intellectual satisfaction in following the shape of his reasoning, even when the specific legal technicalities themselves remained somewhat beyond her. There was, too, a particular respect Charles held for his own clients, however humble their individual disputes might appear from the outside, that Eleanor had come, over the years, to consider one of his finest qualities. He did not treat a small farmer's boundary dispute as beneath his serious attention simply because the sums involved were modest, understanding, as he had once explained to Eleanor with real conviction, that the dispute mattered enormously to the two men actually caught up in it, whatever its relative unimportance to the wider world. This was, Eleanor thought, a version of the same careful attention she herself brought to the household's own modest daily concerns, a recognition that a life's true weight rarely correlates neatly with its outward scale, that a delayed blue dress or a disputed field boundary could carry, for the people actually living through it, every bit as much genuine importance as grander matters that made their way into newspapers and history books. Perkins, the clerk, had worked for Charles for nearly 5 years now, a quiet, capable young man whom Charles occasionally invited to dinner, treating him, Eleanor had noticed with some private amusement, rather like an additional, slightly awkward nephew who required careful feeding and gentle conversational encouragement to properly draw out of his customary reserve. Perkins would marry soon himself, Eleanor gathered from occasional mentions, to a young woman from a neighbouring parish, and Charles had already begun, in his own careful way, considering what modest wedding gift might be appropriate from an employer who valued his clerk's steady, reliable service rather more than his own reserved manner might suggest to a stranger. Eleanor found herself thinking, in these later hours of the night, of Charles moving through his own separate working world each day, the 2 rooms above the stationer's shop, the walls of dark leather-bound volumes, the careful, patient work of untangling other people's disputes, and felt a fresh wave of the same quiet affection that had carried her through 16 years of marriage. They lived, in some sense, 2 entirely separate daily lives, hers bounded by the household's own particular demands, his by the more public, more formally structured world of his profession, and yet these 2 separate lives folded together each evening, at dinner, in these late-hour conversations before sleep, into something that felt, to Eleanor, considerably larger and more sustaining than either life could have managed entirely on its own. Beyond the Whitmores' own front door, the street itself had long since settled into its own nighttime quiet, and it is worth, in these final unhurried minutes, letting your attention drift outward a little, beyond this one particular household, toward the wider small world surrounding it. The lamplighter had made his final rounds hours before, and the street lamps now burned steadily at their careful intervals along the road, small pools of warm gaslight separated by longer stretches of proper darkness, the whole street settling into the particular rhythm every quiet residential road takes on once its households have retired for the evening. A watchman passed occasionally, his slow, measured footsteps and the soft rattle of his lantern, the only real sound breaking the stillness at this late hour, a comforting presence Eleanor had grown so accustomed to over the years that she scarcely registered it consciously anymore, except in the rare instance it went missing on some particular night, when its absence alone would be enough to catch her attention. The houses along the street held their own separate, mostly unknown lives behind darkened windows. Families much like the Whitmores in general, shape though each with its own particular internal texture that Eleanor could only guess at from the occasional glimpsed detail, a child's voice heard faintly through an open window on a summer evening, a particular flower bed tended with obvious care, a certain family's regular Sunday departure for church at precisely the same hour each week, rain or shine, for as long as Eleanor had lived on this street. 2 doors down lived an elderly couple, the Hendersons, whose own children had long since grown and moved away to households of their own, and Eleanor found herself thinking of them now, wondering whether their own quiet evenings held some echo of loneliness that the Whitmore household, still full of children's voices and small ongoing dramas, had not yet needed to confront. She made a private note to call on Mrs. Henderson sometime in the coming week, a small kindness that cost little and that Eleanor suspected the older woman genuinely valued, evidence of a community's slow, steady weave of mutual small attentions that held a street like this one together every bit as effectively as any more formal institution might have managed. Further along, past the chemist's shop where Margaret had apparently been seen with young Mr. Farrow, the high street itself had gone properly dark and quiet now, the shops shuttered, the market square empty until the following Friday's proper trading day, though a few late lights still burned in windows above certain shops. Tradesmen's families settling into their own evening routines much as the Whitmores had settled into theirs. There was something Eleanor found genuinely comforting in this wider picture, imagined rather than actually witnessed at this late hour, an entire small town settling collectively into its nighttime quiet. Hundreds of separate households, each carrying their own particular version of the same basic human concerns. Children raised, accounts balanced, marriages sustained across years of accumulated small shared moments, and each of them, Eleanor liked to think, finding their own particular version of the same quiet satisfaction she herself felt now, looking back over one more ordinary day successfully managed and safely concluded. The church bell, audible from the Whitmore's own bedroom window on quiet nights like this one, marked the hour with its familiar, unhurried toll, and Eleanor found herself, as she often did at this particular late hour, thinking of the generations of townspeople who had heard this same bell mark this same hour across however many decades the church itself had stood on its current site, an unbroken thread of ordinary nights, very much like this one, stretching backward further than any single family's memory could properly reach. Tomorrow, this same street would wake again into its ordinary daytime bustle, tradesmen's carts and nursemaids with their perambulators, and women like Eleanor herself managing their household's particular version of the day's necessary business. But for now, in this late, settled hour, the whole street held itself in a kind of shared, unspoken stillness, every household behind its darkened windows resting from its own particular version of the same universal daily labor, gathering whatever strength the night's rest might restore before the entire small community woke again, together, into another ordinary day. There is one more thread worth following before we let this particular day finally close, and it concerns that half-finished cushion cover Eleanor had been slowly stitching all these recent weeks, the one I mentioned earlier without quite explaining its full significance. It was intended, as I noted before, for whatever eventual trousseau Margaret might one day require, though neither mother nor daughter had spoken that particular word aloud between them, the whole project existing in a kind of comfortable, unstated understanding rather than any formally declared purpose. Eleanor had begun it back in the autumn, long before Mrs. Ashworth's small revelation about young Mr. Farrow, working from a pattern her own mother had taught her decades before, a design of intertwined leaves and small flowers that Eleanor had, over the years, made countless times for countless purposes, cushion covers and handkerchiefs and, once, a christening gown for Alice herself that had since been carefully folded away, awaiting whatever future grandchild might eventually need it. There was a particular tradition in Eleanor's own family of a mother preparing a small collection of such items for a daughter's eventual household, begun modestly and added to slowly across years rather than assembled all at once in a final rush before any actual wedding. Eleanor's own mother had done the same for her, and Eleanor still possessed, tucked away in her own linen chest, several pieces her mother had made decades before, worn now but still occasionally used, a set of embroidered pillowcases that had been part of Eleanor's own modest trousseau, brought into her marriage with Charles, and carried through 16 years of continuous, unremarkable use ever since. She had begun Margaret's own small collection rather earlier than strict necessity required, well before any actual courtship had developed, simply because the work itself took considerable time, and Eleanor had learned, from her own mother's example, that it was better to begin such projects gradually, a few evening hours here and there across several years, rather than attempt to assemble an entire trousseau in some frantic final rush once an actual engagement had been announced. Tonight, thinking of Margaret's confession and Charles's careful, tender unease, Eleanor found herself thinking of this cushion cover with fresh significance, no longer simply a pleasant, unhurried project for some entirely hypothetical future occasion, but potentially, if young Mr. Farrow's courtship continued to develop as Margaret's animated evening conversation had suggested it might, a piece that could conceivably find its actual eventual use rather sooner than Eleanor had originally imagined when she first began stitching it back in the autumn. She thought too of the whole broader collection this single cushion cover belonged to, other pieces already completed and folded carefully away in Eleanor's own linen chest, waiting alongside Margaret's future belongings for whatever eventual day they might finally be needed. A set of table linens, embroidered with the same intertwined leaf pattern, begun 2 years before, a pair of pillowcases, simpler in design but carefully finished, completed just this past winter during the long, quiet evening hours when outdoor activity grew scarce and needlework filled the resulting extra time. Even, tucked at the very bottom of the small dedicated chest, a christening gown Eleanor had begun almost as a private joke with herself, working on it during odd stolen moments over the past year, not because any grandchild's arrival seemed remotely imminent, but because she found in the careful, hopeful work of preparing for a future she could not yet fully picture, a particular kind of quiet, sustaining pleasure that she rarely examined too closely, but that ran, she suspected, very close to the actual center of what mothering a daughter through this particular stretch of her life genuinely meant. This was not vanity exactly, or even simple practicality, though there was certainly some of both mixed into the whole tradition. It was something closer, Eleanor thought, setting the half-finished cushion cover carefully aside for the night, to a kind of ongoing conversation stretched across generations, mother preparing for daughter's future household much as her own mother had prepared for hers, each stitch carrying forward not simply a decorative pattern, but some small measure of accumulated maternal care and hope, passed down through hands that would in time pass it forward again to hands not yet even born. She wondered, briefly, what specific pieces Margaret herself might one day stitch for some future daughter of her own, whether that same intertwined leaf pattern, taught now to 3 generations of women in this particular family line, would continue forward into a 4th, a 5th, stretching out into a future Eleanor herself would never live to see, but could, in this quiet late hour, at least imagine with genuine hope and genuine tenderness. There was something in this thought that settled her, finally, more completely towards sleep than almost anything else the long day had offered, this sense of standing, however briefly and however ordinarily, within some much larger continuous thread of women caring for the women who would come after them, one careful stitch, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. There is a whole further layer to Margaret's situation worth exploring a little more, the particular social machinery that would now, following tonight's conversations with both her parents, begin to move around her, since a young woman's courtship in this world involved rather more formal choreography than simple personal feeling alone. Young Mr. Farrow, having received Charles's cautious blessing to call properly, would now be expected to observe a whole series of small, well-established conventions, beginning with a formal visit to the household during proper calling hours, conducted with Eleanor present in the parlour for at least the visit's opening minutes, a chaperoned arrangement that struck Eleanor's own daughter, she suspected, as faintly ridiculous given how many unchaperoned conversations the 2 young people had apparently already managed after church, but that nonetheless mattered considerably to the wider community's assessment of the courtship's proper respectability. There would be calling cards exchanged, small printed rectangles bearing a name and sometimes a modest border design, left on a household silver tray by the front door as evidence of a proper social call, a whole small system of etiquette surrounding even this seemingly minor gesture, which corner might be turned down to indicate a card left in person rather than by servant, how promptly a returned call ought to follow an initial one, rules that Eleanor herself had absorbed so thoroughly across years of practice that she rarely thought about them consciously anymore, though she remembered finding them bewilderingly complex as a young bride first navigating her own new social world. Margaret would need, too, to begin thinking rather more carefully about her wardrobe than her current sentimental preoccupation with the still-delayed blue dress might suggest she had yet fully grasped. A young woman receiving a suitor's formal calls required a certain minimum standard of dress for those particular occasions, not extravagant. The Whitmore household's modest means would not stretch to extravagance in any case, but carefully considered, appropriate to both the occasion's importance and the family's own respectable but unshowy social position. Eleanor found herself already, mentally, reviewing Margaret's current wardrobe with fresh eyes, considering which pieces might serve for a proper suitor's visit and which would need supplementing, a calculation that would need to factor once again into the household's careful ongoing budget. There would be, too, the wider question of how and when to introduce young Mr. Farrow to the family's broader social circle, a mutual acquaintance dinner perhaps, or an evening gathering like the one whose invitation currently sat waiting on Eleanor's own desk, occasions that would allow the courtship to move gradually from a private family matter into something the wider community might properly observe and inevitably discuss. Mrs. Ashworth, having already demonstrated her considerable appetite for exactly this kind of neighbourhood intelligence, would doubtless prove an enthusiastic, if not entirely discreet, chronicler of whatever developments followed. Eleanor found herself thinking, turning all of this over in these final quiet minutes before sleep, of how much careful, largely invisible labour this entire courtship process actually required, quite separate from whatever genuine feeling young Margaret and young Mr. Farrow might hold for one another. The calling cards, the chaperoned visits, the carefully calculated wardrobe, the strategic social introductions, all of it existed as a kind of elaborate scaffolding built up around the more private, more genuine business of two young people actually coming to know and care for one another. A scaffolding that could feel, from a certain angle, needlessly restrictive, and that felt, from another equally valid angle, like a considered, protective structure designed to give a young woman like Margaret time and space to properly assess a suitor's character before committing her entire future happiness to his keeping. Eleanor herself had navigated this same scaffolding 17 years before, and she remembered finding it, at 19, alternately tedious and genuinely useful, the formal calling structure giving her repeated opportunities to observe Charles across a whole series of separate occasions, rather than being swept toward a decision based on a single dramatic encounter, allowing her, across that patient, carefully structured courtship, to develop real, steady confidence in her eventual choice, rather than simply hoping it would prove sound. She hoped Margaret might find something similar in her own version of this same process. Whatever frustration the formal conventions might initially provoke in a young woman eager simply to know her own heart, without quite so much careful social architecture surrounding the question. There would be calling cards to manage, and proper visiting hours to observe, and a wardrobe to carefully consider within the household's modest means, and Mrs. Ashworth's inevitable commentary to weather with as much good humour as the family could collectively muster. But underneath all of it, Eleanor trusted, would run the same genuine, private thread of real feeling that had carried her own courtship with Charles, 17 years before, toward the steady, sustaining marriage she now, on this ordinary Tuesday night, found herself so quietly grateful for. Before we let the house settle fully into its deepest sleep, there is one more inheritance worth mentioning, since I have referred to Charles's uncle several times now, without ever properly telling his story, and that story shaped this entire household rather more than a passing mention has so far suggested. His name had been Edmund, Charles's father's elder brother, a man who had never married and had lived in this same house alone for the better part of 3 decades before his death, a solicitor himself in his own working years, though his practice had been considerably smaller and less demanding than the one Charles had since built up in the same small town. Eleanor had met him only twice before his death, both occasions formal family gatherings rather early in her own marriage, and she remembered him mostly as a quiet, somewhat reserved man, courteous but not especially warm, the kind of relative one respects rather than loves deeply, at least on such brief acquaintance. It had come as some considerable surprise, therefore, when Edmund's will named Charles as the primary heir to both the house itself and a modest additional sum that had allowed the young couple, still in the more precarious early years of Charles's own practice, to weather what might otherwise have been a genuinely difficult financial stretch. Charles had explained, at the time, that his uncle had never had children of his own to inherit either the house or whatever affection he possessed, and had apparently, in his own quiet way, favoured his brother's son above the other more distant relatives who might reasonably have expected some share of the modest estate. Eleanor thought of Edmund sometimes, moving through rooms that had been entirely his own private domain for so many years before she and Charles had ever set foot in them, and she found herself, particularly on nights like this one, genuinely curious about the whole private inner life he must have lived here, alone, across 3 decades, in rooms that now rang with 4 children's voices and the accumulated clutter of a large active family, so different from whatever quieter, more solitary existence Edmund himself had apparently preferred. There were still small traces of him scattered through the house, if one knew where to look. The clock on the dining-room mantel, with its own small family legend of having stopped for a full year after his mother's death before an unwitting young cousin wound it back into motion, a collection of legal volumes in Charles's own study that had originally belonged to Edmund's practice, some of them still bearing his careful, precise marginal notes in a hand not unlike Charles's own, a small visible thread of professional inheritance passed from uncle to nephew, along with the house itself, the apple tree in the back garden, planted by Edmund himself some years before either Charles or Eleanor had ever met him, its fruit still faithfully appearing each autumn regardless of how many years had passed since the hands that first planted it had gone still. Charles spoke of his uncle rarely, and always with a particular careful gentleness that suggested more complicated feeling than his usual measured manner generally revealed, and Eleanor had learned over the years not to press too hard on the subject, sensing some private grief or regret she was not fully permitted to understand, whether from some falling out in earlier years or simply the ordinary sadness of losing a relative one had not managed to know quite as well as one might have wished before death made further knowing impossible. She thought, tonight, of how strange and how quietly moving it was that this entire household, 4 children and a 16-year marriage and every small daily ritual she had described across this long day's telling, had been made possible, in some real material sense, by the choices of a solitary, reserved man she had met only twice, who had lived and worked and eventually died in these same rooms, leaving behind him this house and this modest fortune, and, perhaps most lastingly of all, this apple tree that still produced its faithful autumn fruit for children he had never lived to meet. There is something in this that feels worth sitting with, Eleanor thought, in these last quiet minutes before her own thoughts, too, finally surrendered fully to sleep. None of us build our lives entirely from nothing. Every comfortable house, every steady family tradition, every apple pie made from fruit off a tree someone else planted decades before, carries forward some earlier person's choices and labor and quiet, largely unacknowledged care, whether we ever properly learn their full story or not. Edmund had given them this house without ever knowing Margaret's particular laugh, or Thomas's blunt philosophy on marriage, or Alice's devoted friendship with a rag doll named Dorothy, and yet all of it, this entire rich, ordinary, precious family life Eleanor had spent this whole long day quietly managing and quietly loving, had grown, in some real sense, from soil he himself had first prepared. She hoped, drifting now finally toward her own full rest, that whatever she and Charles managed to build across their own remaining years together might, someday, offer some similar quiet gift to children and grandchildren not yet born, a house kept warm and well tended, an apple tree faithfully producing its fruit, a family clock kept carefully wound and ticking steadily onward, carrying forward, long after her own particular Tuesday had faded entirely from anyone's living memory, some small, patient, ongoing thread of care into whatever future still lay, entirely unknown and entirely hopeful, ahead. There was one further small cabinet in the house worth mentioning, tucked in a corner of the kitchen, that held the family's modest collection of household remedies, since keeping a family well, in a world without the easy convenience of a chemist's shop always close at hand for every minor complaint, required its own particular kind of quiet domestic knowledge that Eleanor had built up gradually across 16 years of practical mothering. There was a small bottle of camphorated oil, rubbed onto small chests during winter colds, and a tin of mustard powder kept for the occasional mustard plaster when a chill threatened to settle too deeply into someone's lungs. There was witch hazel for the ordinary bumps and scrapes that 4 active children produced with reliable regularity, and a small jar of honey, kept as much for soothing sore throats as for its use in Eleanor's own baking, and a modest supply of chamomile, dried and stored carefully, brewed into a gentle tea whenever one of the children struggled to settle for sleep, or whenever Eleanor herself, on her more difficult evenings, found she needed something to quiet her own restless thoughts before bed. Eleanor had learnt most of this practical knowledge from her own mother, who had learnt it in turn from her mother before her, a whole quiet inheritance of domestic care passed down through generations of women managing their family's ordinary health without, in most cases, needing to trouble a proper doctor for every minor complaint. The doctor himself, the same kindly, tired-looking man who had attended Thomas through his difficult fever those years before, was reserved for genuinely serious concerns, His visits costly enough that Eleanor's own careful household economy required real discernment about when his particular expertise was truly necessary and when her own accumulated knowledge and the modest cabinet of remedies in the kitchen corner would serve just as well. This was not, Eleanor understood, a system without its real limitations and real dangers, and she thought sometimes, with a private gratitude she rarely voiced aloud, of how fortunate the family had been across these 16 years, that whatever illnesses had visited them, Thomas's fever the most serious among them, had ultimately resolved well, that her own careful vigilance and the doctor's proper attention when truly needed had so far proven sufficient to keep the whole family safely through every difficulty life had so far presented. She checked this particular evening, as she generally did before bed, that Alice's slightly pale cheeks at tea had indeed signified nothing more than an ordinary tired child, rather than the beginning of anything more concerning. Pressing a gentle hand to her youngest daughter's forehead while tucking her in, finding it cool and unremarkable, and felt the same small private relief she felt every single night this same simple check confirmed her children's continued good health. This particular vigilance, she thought, never fully switched off, not after Thomas's fever, not after 16 years of careful mothering, a quiet watchfulness that ran beneath every other task of an ordinary day, checking foreheads, noting appetites, watching for any small sign that might require more serious attention than a cup of chamomile tea or a spoonful of honey could properly address. Tonight, thankfully, required none of this deeper vigilance. Thomas slept soundly with his small tin soldier. Alice slept curled around Dorothy, her breathing soft and untroubled. Margaret slept with whatever new lightness her mother's understanding had brought her. The kitchen cabinet's modest remedies remained undisturbed, unneeded, waiting patiently for whatever minor complaints some future ordinary day might eventually bring, while this particular night, at least, asked nothing more of Eleanor's careful attention than the simple, sustaining pleasure of watching her whole family rest safely, healthily, together, beneath one single well-tended roof. There is a particular tradition, too, that belongs to this household each December, one that had not yet arrived this particular year, but that Eleanor found her thoughts drifting toward briefly in these final quiet minutes, since the whole day's small evidence of Margaret's approaching adulthood had stirred a certain wistfulness about how the family's own established rituals might, in time, need to adapt to a household growing gradually smaller. Christmas in the Whitmore house followed its own well-established pattern, built up gradually across 16 years, much like the Tuesday evening reading tradition, or Margaret's slowly assembled trousseau, each year adding some small new element while preserving the essential core that made it recognizably their own particular family custom, rather than simply a generic observance of the season. The tree itself, a modest fir set up in the parlor corner some days before the 25th, decorated with small candles carefully watched whenever lit, and a collection of ornaments accumulated over the years, some purchased, some made by the children themselves during their earlier years, a slightly lopsided paper star Thomas had crafted at perhaps 6 years old, that Eleanor still hung each year with genuine tenderness despite its increasingly worn and faded condition. There was a particular pudding, made from a recipe passed down through Eleanor's own family, that required weeks of advanced preparation, and a tradition of the whole family attending church together on Christmas morning before returning home to a modest but carefully prepared feast, and small gifts exchanged afterward, nothing extravagant given the household's careful budget, but chosen with real thought, a new book for Margaret, some small addition to Thomas's collection of adventure novels, a new dress for whichever doll currently held Alice's particular devotion. Eleanor found herself wondering, this year, what shape this coming December might take, whether Margaret's courtship, should it continue developing as tonight's conversation suggested it well might, would mean a somewhat different Christmas than the family had previously known, perhaps a young man's presence at their table for the first time, or perhaps, in years further ahead than this particular December, Margaret's own absence entirely, celebrating instead in some future household of her own that Eleanor could not yet fully picture. This thought carried its familiar bittersweet weight, the same complicated mixture of pride and quiet grief that had accompanied nearly every reflection on Margaret's approaching adulthood throughout this long day. But Eleanor found, turning it over one final time before sleep finally claimed her fully, that the grief itself had softened somewhat across these evening hours. Margaret's own happy confession and Charles's tender paternal unease, and the whole family's steady, established traditions all working together to reassure her that whatever changes lay ahead, however the household's particular shape might shift across the coming years, its essential core, this same steady, sustaining warmth built up across 16 patient years, would likely carry forward regardless, adapting itself gradually to whatever new shape the family's continuing story required. There would be other Decembers, other Tuesdays, other ordinary days much like this one, each carrying forward some version of these same well-established rituals: the tree and its lopsided paper star, the family pudding, Charles's evening readings, Eleanor's own careful, patient management of a household that had, across these 16 years, become something considerably larger and more sustaining than the sum of its individual daily tasks might suggest. And whatever changes the coming years brought, Eleanor trusted this same essential warmth would find some way to carry forward too, however its particular shape might need to shift and adapt, into whatever future still waited, patient and unknown, just beyond the edge of tonight's deep, well-earned rest. One last small object deserves mention before we let the house settle fully into its rest. A plain wooden box, kept on the top shelf of the parlour cupboard, containing every letter Charles had written Eleanor during their brief engagement all those years ago, alongside the handful she had kept from her own girlhood correspondence with her sister Caroline before either of them had married and settled so far apart. Eleanor rarely opened this box, perhaps once or twice a year at most, but she knew exactly where it sat, and its presence alone offered a particular quiet comfort, evidence carefully preserved of every earlier version of herself: the 18-year-old who had laughed at Charles's unromantic proposal, the anxious young bride writing home to a sister who could not attend the wedding, the tired new mother describing Margaret's first uncertain steps in a letter that had taken nearly a week to reach its destination. Someday, she thought, closing her eyes at last, Margaret might keep a similar box of her own, filled with whatever letters young Mr. Farrow chose to write her, evidence of her own particular courtship, preserved carefully for whatever quiet late-night moments, decades from now, might call for their gentle rereading. Let us settle now, finally, into the deepest part of the night, the hour when even the watchman's footsteps have grown rare and distant, when the whole house and the whole street around it lie held in that particular stillness that belongs only to the very early hours, long after midnight, and still some good distance from dawn. Eleanor sleeps now, has slept for some hours already, her breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm of genuine rest, one arm curled beneath her pillow in the particular position she has favoured. Charles has told her more than once with quiet affection, for as long as he has known her. Beside her, Charles sleeps too, his own breathing slightly deeper, slightly rougher, the particular sound Eleanor has grown so accustomed to across 16 years that she scarcely registers it as separate from the general texture of nighttime silence anymore. The fire in their own bedroom grate has burned down now to the barest orange glow, banked carefully enough by Eleanor's practised hand before bed, that a spark still lives somewhere beneath the grey ash, waiting for morning's careful coaxing back into proper flame. The room holds the particular smell of a house settled fully into night, cooling plaster and the faint lingering trace of the lavender water Eleanor wears each day, mixed now with the simple, unremarkable smell of two people sleeping quietly side by side after a long, full day. Down the hall, in the nursery, Thomas sleeps deeply, sprawled across his narrow bed in the particular careless posture of a boy who has spent his whole day in vigorous, uncomplicated motion, one hand having found its way, sometime in the deep hours, back to the small tin soldier tucked beneath his pillow, exactly as Eleanor suspected it would. His breathing carries the faint occasional catch of a child still growing into his own changing body. Nothing concerning, simply the ordinary music of an 11-year-old boy's untroubled sleep. Across the narrow hallway, Alice sleeps curled small and close around Dorothy, the worn rag doll, held with the same fierce, uncomplicated devotion she brings to every waking hour of her small life, her breathing so soft and shallow that a careful listener might need to watch the slight rise and fall of her blanket to be entirely certain of it. Somewhere in her small dreaming mind, perhaps, a brave rabbit and his newly invented friend continue their search for home through some imagined forest. The story Eleanor never quite finished, still unspooling forward in whatever private world sleep opens up for a 7-year-old. And Margaret, in her own room at the end of the hall, sleeps too, though her rest tonight carries, Eleanor might have guessed had she been awake to observe it, a particular lightness that had not been there the night before, some genuine private weight finally set down, the secret of William Farrow no longer a secret at all, but a real, acknowledged thread now woven properly into the family's shared life, with all its accompanying scaffolding of calling cards and chaperoned visits and careful wardrobe considerations still ahead of her, but faced now openly rather than carried alone. The whole house, in this deepest stretch of the night, holds itself in this particular collective stillness, 4 sleeping family members and their various private dreams, the old clock in the dining room continuing its steady, patient ticking through hours no one remains awake to hear, the mantel photographs keeping their own silent vigil in the dark parlour below, Eleanor's own mother's young unknowing face and the wedding portraits, 2 rigid serious figures, and the more recent, imperfect family photograph with its scowling son and fidgeting youngest daughter, all of them holding their frozen moments in the dark, waiting for morning's light to make them visible again. Outside, the street lamps continue their steady burning, small pools of warm gaslight along an otherwise dark and empty road, and somewhere beyond the edge of town, the first very faint suggestion of approaching dawn has not yet begun to touch the eastern sky, still some hours distant yet. The whole town sleeps in this same collective stillness, hundreds of separate households, each holding their own particular version of this same ordinary, precious nighttime rest. Tradesmen and their families, the elderly Hendersons 2 doors down, Sarah and her widowed mother in their smaller house across town, all of them, for these few dark hours, released entirely from the day's separate labours and worries, simply resting, simply breathing, simply being carried forward through the dark, toward whatever tomorrow will eventually ask of them. There is nothing more required of Eleanor tonight. The accounts are balanced. The blue dress will arrive within the week, or it will not, and either way the household will continue on much as it always has. Margaret's courtship has been properly acknowledged, and will unfold now according to its own slow, careful, well-established rhythm, calling cards and chaperoned visits and all the rest, toward whatever eventual conclusion it is meant to reach. Thomas's tin soldier keeps its faithful nighttime post beneath his pillow. Alice's brave rabbit continues searching for home somewhere in the private country of her dreams. The fire holds its small buried spark, patient beneath the ash, waiting for morning. This is what an ordinary day becomes, in the end, once it has finally fully concluded. Not a story with any dramatic climax or clean resolution, but simply this, a household settled safely into rest, its various small threads, some resolved and some still gently unspooling into whatever comes next, held together for one more night beneath a single roof, warmed by fires banked low and blankets pulled close, and the accumulated, largely invisible labor of a woman who spent this entire day, as she has spent so many thousands of days before it, quietly ensuring that everyone she loves might arrive safely at exactly this moment, this deep, settled, well-earned rest. That is the whole of it, really. One ordinary Tuesday carefully lived and carefully closed, nothing more dramatic than a delayed dress and a quietly happy confession, and yet somehow, entirely enough. Sleep well, friend, wherever you are listening from tonight. Let the Whitmore household's quiet ordinary Tuesday carry you gently the rest of the way down into whatever rest your own long day has earned. The fire is banked, the house is still, everyone is finally, safely home.